Hi there, welcome, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Jason Scholder, and this is Learning to Fail. People are complicated. I know a lot of complicated people. My guest today is Andy Ray. Andy is a master craftsman and author of countless books and articles on woodworking. We had an amazing conversation about life, loss, and what we've learned along the way. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Before we get started, I just want to say how much I appreciate people taking time out of their lives to talk to me, let alone listen. This podcast is my avenue for expanding the way I think and the things I think about. If you like what you hear, please tell your friends about Learning to Fail and encourage them to tell theirs. Take a moment to rate us on iTunes and check out our website for additional information about each of the people we interview. While you're there, please visit our Donate and Amazon pages. Each page will give you clear instructions on what to do. For the time being, we're a completely donation-based podcast, so all of our episodes are being brought to you by you. Our donation page will allow you to make one-time or recurring donations. Our Amazon portal enables you to support the podcast without spending any extra money of your own. Please bookmark our Amazon page and start your shopping there every time you visit or buy anything on Amazon. The most helpful thing you can do is simply to listen to the podcast and encourage others to do the same. The world will be a better place when we can all start learning to fail together. Let's start failing now with Andy Ray. I'm here with Andy Ray, who is a friend of mine. We shared a shop together for about a year, felt like 5 years.
We did.
Not because of our experience of sharing it together, but just the nightmare of construction that was going on there the entire time. So I had moved my company into that building and was told there'd be 2 years before anybody would start to even enter the space I rented. And within 2 months, they were tearing the place apart and just destroying all this merchandise that I ship all over the world. It was a nightmare. But in the process, we met, which was really great. And I remember meeting you in the beginning, and like right away we started talking shop. And then I wanted to borrow a clamp, and you're like, "You're not touching my clamps." So I was like, "I have some experience." He's like, "No, man, these are fine woodworking clamps, and you can't touch them."
That's before I knew you were a bona fide woodworker.
I understood. It was a funny experience. So I was like, "All right." I was like, "I know what I'm doing." You're like, "Nah, no, you don't."
Shop policy.
So you know what? As somebody who's very persnickety about his tools and stuff, I understood it and respected it, and it was fine. But anyway, it was funny. So, but I'm really appreciate you being here, and it's exciting to get this started because we have a shared history in woodworking, but your history in woodworking outpaces mine by miles and miles, and so I really am looking forward to hearing your story. As far as how you got into it, I know you've published a bunch of books and I don't know how many articles. And also, if you're comfortable talking about some of your personal life, I want this to be as genuine and personal as possible because you're someone I care about and I would like that to come through. So feel free to share or not share whatever you want. Say any words you want, cussing, whatever, doesn't matter. This is damn immediately. So, really, you should just feel like we're having a chat in the shop like we used to.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Well, thanks, Jason. So maybe I should start out way back when in my woodworking world where I started from, which was pure happenstance, I have to think. My brother worked for a famous woodworker by the name of George Nakashima back in, probably in the 80s or maybe late 70s, and he was mostly a carpenter and helped build George's daughter's house across the road from George Nakashima's compound, where he made slab style furniture, we could call it. It's a lot of solid wood furniture, and he's well known for his huge dining tables and other kind of tables and chairs, and his just his attention to the wood itself as a living, breathing material. And so Gurney, my brother, had worked there, did a little bit of work in the shop, but he likes to be outdoors as a carpenter. And I was out of a job. He said, "Why don't you go get a job with George?" And so I did. And I spent a year in his finishing shop, wiping, hand wiping oils with no ventilation, no gloves, onto some of the most spectacular wood I've still ever come across. And left about a year later with a dysfunctioning liver, but with this incredible thirst for how to put that wood together, because I never really did any woodwork per se. I just was doing finishing for a year. And so George was really the inspiration for me to get into the craft that I'm in today, by really being exposed to some of the nicest furniture out there. And from there, I just went from cabinet shop to cabinet shop, working for people that I admired, and I'd look at their work and then apply for a job and spend hours sanding and moving up the ranks until I started learning a little bit about the craft. And was living in Princeton, New Jersey at the time, with a pretty ramshackle place called Edel Farm, where we had 188 acres in the township. And it was owned by a man by the name of Alex Edel, who founded Sculpture House, which was the first and only sculpture accessory store or supply in the country to supply sculptors with sculpting tools, as well as Roma clay, which he invented, which is still used by sculptors around the world. Anyway, we all had cheap rent, and I had a small, tiny studio that I shared with another sculptor and a photographer, Dave Can and Connie Wellnitz. And eventually, everybody moved out. The studio next to ours, and they moved out, and I claimed all the space. So I started out with the company name called Andy Ray Woodworking Studios, with a plural, because I've always been in more than one studio. And that was my start. I just didn't, I didn't know a whole lot in the beginning, but working for other cabinet makers and woodworkers kind of cemented some of my knowledge, and definitely my desire to keep designing and building in the craft. And I think I have George to thank for that. So here I am today in my 14th shop in the same building that Jason and I shared, still dealing with construction all around me, and water outages and electric outages, and rainwater coming through the top of the building onto my floor, and vacuuming up lakes, and still putting out work. And in the interim, I landed a job probably 15 years ago now, maybe 20 years, with a publication called American Woodworker that was housed at Rodale Press in a little town called Emmaus, Pennsylvania, which is basically a suburb of Allentown, southeastern PA. And I spent 6 years as a senior editor for the magazine, writing about woodworking and traveling all over the country, interviewing woodworking guys and editing stories and taking photos. And that got me into writing. And it was pure happenstance that I got the job, because, again, I was out of work, and a friend called, or a editor from the magazine called, Ellis Wallentyne, and he was just kind of pumping for news to see if there was anything of interest that he might use me in the magazine. And out of the blue, I said, "Are you guys looking for an editor?" And they just at that time were looking for someone to fill a spot. So I came up for an interview with the executive editor, David Sloan, who also happened to be the publisher. And I had no prior writing experience. I'd come from a family of writers. My stepfather was a writer his whole life, so it wasn't a foreign entity to me. But he said, "I'll give you 5 weeks. And if it works out, we'll hire you." And then 5 weeks later, he said, "You got the job." And it took me about a year to learn how to edit a story, which was a rough first year at the time. But since then, writing has become fairly fluid to me. And I guess in 1998, I began my first project in writing, which was a pretty big book that I put together called The Complete Illustrated Guide to Furniture and Cabinet Construction, and it was published by Taunton Press. And since then, I've written 4 other books, I guess, on woodworking, all on woodworking, made some DVDs, taught classes, blogged on the internet, and so on and so forth. And I'm right now in the process of revising that first book for a updated version because it's getting close to 20 years old, which is kind of cool. It's just to keep it on the market and keep it relevant.
Yeah, I mean, the technology has
Yeah.
changed hugely since then, right? I mean,
It has, and one of the things that Taunton has done is they've taken all this stuff and they've electrified it or electronified it, put it online, and you can buy a chapter from one of my books, you can buy a segment from one of my DVDs, you can buy all of it electronically, or you can buy the paperback version. About 2 years ago, it got translated into German, and I got a royalty check from Germany for like $1,000 because like 500 Germans had bought the book. And then last year, it got translated into Korean.
wow.
So I'm just waiting for Qatar to call. So right now, my mix is furniture design and building and writing about it. And I've been doing a lot of writing for Woodcraft magazine the past 5 years or more. Mostly project articles and some technique articles. And then I'm always looking for commission work from people who appreciate fine woodworking to get furniture out the door.
Yeah, I built furniture for a long time in LA. I mean, that was what I did before I moved to Asheville. And I got to a point where I'm so fastidious with my work that, no one could afford the amount of time it would take me to build something. I mean, and I couldn't afford my own work, And I mean, there's definitely people in LA with money, and there's a few of them who are willing to pay for stuff like that, but it's the exception more than the norm. And the last thing that I built for someone, it was, I don't know, like a $2,500 dresser or something, but it was nice, and it was small. And this guy owned a Nakashima, is that his name?
Yeah.
He owned a Nakashima table with like the butterfly joints and everything, and
live edges.
And after I installed the dresser in his house, he's like, now I own a Nakashima and a Jason.
Well, it should be that way because what we do is fine woodwork. It's not. It's very utilitarian in my book because that's what I like to make. I like to make functional furniture, but at the same time, it's beautiful because you spend a lot of time fussing over all the little details. And time in our world is money. If you spend 10 hours on something, you need to be paid for the 10 hours you put in. And it's a struggle to be able to build the kind of stuff that I like to design and get paid for it. So finding the clients is kind of half the issue.
Yeah, no, totally. I remember I had sort of funny realization when I moved into this house that I live in now, where I have a kitchen that I hate.
Yeah.
But it's totally functional. Like, this is the kind of kitchen, if it's, oak raised panel doors. I mean, I built cabinets for a while, and if I walked into a house like this, I mean, I would shame the customers into letting me replace the entire thing.
Yeah.
And I walked into this house, and the first thing I was like, I cannot believe that I'm about to buy a house with the exact kind of kitchen that I loathe. And I was like, maybe I can put handles on the doors. I had all these fixes that would be affordable to make it a little less awful. None of them have I done because I've always had this fantasy that I was going to replace the kitchen. But it's just not shitty enough to replace. Like,
yeah, it's nice. I'm looking at it now. It's a nice kitchen, but it's all factory work.
It's got zero character.
It's what everybody sees everywhere else.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunately red oak, which is America's most popular wood right now and has been for years. Yeah. And it just doesn't.
It's the aesthetic of ignorance.
Yes.
Yeah. When I see red oak.
Create a beautiful atmosphere.
I feel badly saying that because I know, I've just insulted the majority of the country. But when I talk to people about wood and they don't really know me. People haven't heard that many woods,
Yeah.
And they're like, I really like oak. I'm like, God, really? Like, that's just the most.
Well, it's interesting because there's red oak and there's white oak. There's actually all kinds of oaks. There's hundreds of oaks in the world, but the two common oaks that we deal with here in the States and particularly in this area, Western North Carolina, are red oak and white oak. And I love white oak. It's got this subtle color and character that speaks of elegance and refinement. And you put it next door to red oak and you've got garish Trump wood.
Trump wood.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got Sanders. You've got Bernie Sanders, yes. White oak. And
no, Bernie's not white oak.
He's not white oak. What would you call Bernie Sanders?
Bernie might be, I don't know, something semi-exotic, but it should be local.
Is he curly maple?
He could be, curly maple would be a good idea. He's something nice, but a little.
He's from Vermont, right?
So edgy.
I mean, it would be maple would make sense.
Yeah.
I remember just. I remember the thing about. one of the reasons I quit making cabinets and furniture, I mean, there were a lot of reasons, but one of them was just realizing that people didn't care.
Yeah.
They didn't. It wasn't worth it to them. Like the amount of work that I was going to put into it, whether they wanted it or not, they didn't care about it. And when I moved into this house and I had this horrible kitchen and I kept it, I realized I don't care enough either.
You fell into that character.
And I was like, wow, now I understand why I couldn't sell more jobs, because it's just not. It's not as important to people as it felt to me when I was making it.
It's almost like we're all artists. And it's almost as if you have to sell your work to an artist, because artists have that sensitivity to appreciate the difference between white oak and red oak, let's say, or, you know, a door that's been specifically designed to fit your space versus something coming from a factory that goes to thousands and thousands of homes.
Right.
But looking at your kitchen now, you know, one of the things about doors and drawers, I wrote a book on building doors and drawers, is that a kitchen especially is the public face of a kitchen is all of its doors and drawers, not the casework. So the work to revise and update your kitchen would be just build new doors and new drawer fronts. You can leave the drawer boxes in place, keep all the hardware, and put your new doors and new drawer faces right in there and have what you want.
Yeah, I know. I know that I could cheat it like that, and that would be Hollywooding my kitchen, and it would make a lot of sense. But I also don't like the functionality of the drawers. They don't open all the way, and the bottoms of the drawers are where I have heavy stuff. The bottoms are falling out, you know, and disconnecting. I mean, it is a rabbit hole I'm just not willing to go down.
I don't blame you.
But the house is for sale, and it's got a lovely kitchen.
We like your kitchen.
For anybody who likes red oak. So I'm always fascinated with the story. You know, the podcast is learning to fail, and that's sort of the concept behind this whole thing. It's a phrase I learned when I was shooting a documentary about comedians a number of years ago, and this in comedy, everybody fails their first time, or most people do, and learning to fail, especially in comedy, is really an important part of getting good. Like, you have to learn how to endure failure on stage, because you're gonna fail some of the time you're up there. I mean, I was at an open mic last night where I performed. I was second to last, so I failed to get there on time to be have a better spot on the list. But as a result, I watched every comic before me, and some of them just flatlined the room. I mean, there were no laughter for the entire 5 or 6 minutes.
What's, out of curiosity, what's the preferred spot? First?
Well, the fullest. So whenever the room is the fullest, that's when you want to be on stage. And last night the room was fullest for the first comic, and then I just watched it thin out 1 or 2 people at a time. It was very, very subtle until before I got on stage, unrelated to me, they hadn't announced me yet. The whole front row got up and left simultaneously. So by the time I got up there was, I was talking to just the back of the room.
That's got to be disheartening.
Oh man, it was brutal. But I'm used to it because I'm new on the scene, and I end up going last every time. So I'm kind of accustomed to having a smaller crowd and having to really draw laughs out of there, And I record my sets, but my recording device is on the stool on the stage. So it gets me, but it doesn't get enough of the laughter. So I can't tell when I listen back if things are working or not, unless it's really funny and the room totally busts up. That I can hear. But if it's just like a gentle, appreciative laughter, doesn't pick it up.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to bring that concept into other things. I mean, I can only imagine, and I certainly, could share war stories about things I learned along the way and the horrors of making expensive mistakes. More and more expensive as the jobs got more expensive. But this process of learning to fail, and what are some of your greatest failures / learning experiences?
It's a great question, because it's in woodworking, and especially in furniture making, it happens all the time, because in my work I'm usually doing something I'm designing and building a piece of furniture that I've never designed or built before. So a lot of the joinery and a lot of the process is similar, but there's going to be something coming up that's going to throw me a curveball. So it's common every week that I'm in the shop. But it made me think about what you're saying, that I've spent a lot of time with a lot of woodworkers in their shops, and I've worked alongside woodworkers, and so many times I see somebody do something where they fuck up, they make a mistake, the wood's trashed, or maybe they even get hurt, and I see them walk away, and when they come back, they haven't processed what's happened. They haven't looked at that and said a real simple question: what did I do wrong? And they just plow ahead, and then they start making the same mistake again and again. And so my mistakes, one of my worst mistakes ever, was 5 days into a cabinet shop, which I subsequently worked for 5 years for a really awesome man by the name of Bill Draper up in Percy, Pennsylvania. And I put my hand into a dado blade. And if you're not a woodworker, I'll tell you what a dado blade is. It's a series of stacked saw blades that make a wider saw blade, essentially. So here I was with a spinning dado blade that was about 3/4 of an inch wide as opposed to an 1/8 inch wide. And through my own ignorance, I put my hand into the blade. And I spent 5 weeks out of the shop and then on workman's comp, and then I came back and faced my fears and looked at that same table saw and got back on it, and that went well. And the thing that I did more than anything was ask myself, what happened? What did I do? What did I do wrong? Is there something I could do that would prevent that in the future? And there was, because I was looking at it and studying where I had screwed up on that cut. You know, it's embarrassing when you make something and you do something wrong and something gets screwed up, and we're all embarrassed by that. But if we don't look at it and say, why did that happen? Then we're probably destined to keep making the same moves again and again and again, instead of, you know, I see it as an opportunity to move up on the learning curve and get better at what I'm doing, especially when safety is concerned. But it's more than just safety. It's just being able to make stuff that's sound, and you make it in good time without too many mistakes, without a lot of frustration, and you can pay your bills because you get paid for the time that you put into your work. So just asking the question, why did I do that, is a really good one. And for me, it was a very basic woodworking tenet. I was putting my hand on the aft side of the blade, on the forward side, which you really in any case should never do, trying to drop a piece of wood onto a spinning blade, and the wood caught, and my hand was holding the wood, my left hand, and it went along for the ride and went into the blade, and there was blood everywhere. But I healed fine. It took stitches and lost a little bit of bone, but everything worked out pretty well.
Just a little bit of bone.
Bit
I like how casual you say that. I lost a little bit of bone.
But it was, you know, it was a scary thing. But at the same time, my reaction was, "Wow, why did I do that? Why did I do that?" Because I didn't know. I was a pretty green woodworker at the time, and I subsequently learned what happened, and that's put me in good stead, certainly for table saw use. Since then, that was probably 15 to 20 years ago, and I haven't had any serious accidents, knock on wood, since then.
I'll never forget when I put my first table saw together in my shop. I got a real one. Like I had, you know, a Ryobi kind of, job site saw that I was using, and
cabinet saw.
Yeah, well, this was not. I mean, they sold it as a cabinet saw. It was like $500. It had a built-in sliding table. It had so many things going that anybody who knows woodworking would know not to buy it, because it just offered too much for $500. And so I replaced it with a Powermatic, which is it was industry standard, you know.
That's what I mean by cabinet saw. Yeah.
So, and I remember like putting the cast iron table together. I almost chopped my finger off just putting the table together.
Yeah.
And that's when I learned to do the middle screw first, so that there's no weight, because you use 3 screws along the side to level the table. And if you do one side, you're still holding the whole weight of the cast iron. Anyway, so but I didn't somehow. I literally don't know how. I didn't cut my hand. And there was another time I was slicing bread on a bandsaw, and I swear, kind of like in a Pulp Fiction way, when the bullets went right through them, I'm telling you, my hand went through that blade and did not get cut. Like, there's no way that I didn't. The way I did it, I certainly wasn't conscious of the blade possibly cutting my hand when it was cutting the bread, and the way I was holding the bread, I gotta tell you, I'm to this day, I feel like the angels intervened and somehow my hand was saved. I mean, not a scratch.
Wow.
But I have since hurt myself a couple times. But so anyway, so I got this table saw together. It took me 2 days by myself, following the instructions, one bolt at a time, and I'd never put anything together like that in my entire life. And I didn't know when I got into woodworking that I was also going to have to become a machinist. Like nobody told me that. And so I got the thing together, and it was like 4 p.m. It was the second day, and I was like pretty excited. It was really powerful, like 5 horsepower. Whereas the other thing, I don't even know if it had a horsepower. It might have been dog power on the Ryobi saw. And
bunny power.
It was bunny power, and so I went to just cut one piece of wood so I could just cut something, you know. And I took a pretty small piece of plywood. I ran it through the blade. It caught on the blade and shot 50 feet across the driveway, like almost hit me in the head on the way. I just ducked, and I was like, okay, I'm done for the day. Yeah. I was like, there's no way I'm doing anything else. Like, I got it together, and I know that it cuts.
That's horrible.
And then I never had an incident like that again. But when I sold my business, the guy who bought my shop, on his first day in the shop, on that same saw, but now in a new location, you know, where I'd moved to, a real shop instead of a garage, he had a piece of wood fly off on him the same way, but I had finished cabinets behind him, and it flew right through the back of a cabinet that was totally done, you know. And it was like a $10 piece of material to fix it, but the entire cabinet had to be disassembled and put back together because the back was like grooved into the sides and stuff. I mean, it was saw. Yeah, it was just a night. Well, no, it's like that saw is right. If you're a beginner, it lets you know.
Well, it's powerful, but do you know why that wood? And for people that don't understand this, the wood's coming towards you. It's coming, the blade is throwing it behind you, essentially.
Right.
But do you know why that was happened to you, and why it happened to your new?
I'm assuming it was probably the same reason. I have no idea what he was doing.
Yeah.
In my case, I mean, I'm sure I didn't have enough of a solid like grip on the wood, and I think the biggest reason it happened to me is that I was terrified of the saw.
Yeah, that's a bad
scenario.
Like,
I mean, using a power tool is like walking into the ghetto. You have got to be confident you're going to survive.
Yeah, confidence helps.
And if you're not, I mean, the machine picks up on it. It's like a horse or a dog.
Well, knowledge helps build your confidence too. Knowing why a piece of wood would fly back at you, which is called kickback, which is basically the rising teeth at the backside of the blade contact the work and then traps it between the entire blade and throws it towards you. So in essence, one of the basic scenarios is to make sure that your work is fully against the rip fence the entire time it's passing the blade. If it starts to creep away, the backside of the blade can grab it and throw it.
That's what I was going to say. I thought happened, but then I didn't know, and I didn't want to say it out loud.
Well, that's back to my question. Back to my question. Ask yourself why. Stop and say, what happened? What was that? But a lack of knowledge can also stop you from going that far because you don't know. It's like, I don't know why that happened. It's just a really powerful, mean machine.
Yeah, I just thought I got the wrong saw. I was ready to return it.
Yeah. Well, today's, luckily, the biggest change, I think, in table saws, other than they've got a device now that senses flesh and will stop a blade when your finger touches it. And you may get a nick, but no more than a 32nd of an inch deep.
Wow.
Which is a machine called a saw stop, which has a cartridge inside that just clamps the blade in milliseconds when it detects flesh touching it. But the other thing that's happened besides that, and that's a really expensive saw and apparently well made, I've never used one, but is the introduction of proper splitters, which is a piece of metal that rides behind your saw blade. And that's what stops kickback, because your wood, if it starts to drift away from the fence, your wood contacts the splitter instead of the back teeth that are rising out of the table, and it stops it from pushing it and pulling it or forcing it back towards you. The new part of that is that the splitter, almost every saw you buy these days, and even 10, 20 years ago or 5 years ago on the market, comes with a splitter, but they're awkward. They get in the way. They have to be removed for non-through cuts like a stop dado or something like that. And they're awkward to do that. And the newer splitters are based on an older European design with the woodworkers there have been using for years, which is this curving piece of metal that when you retract the blade, it follows with the blade, so you can remove, usually it doesn't get in the way unless you're making certain specific cuts. And they've designed them now to get them in and out of the saw real quick with just a quick release type hardware instead of bolts and nuts.
I would think they would have that be independently height adjustable. Like, why wouldn't you be able to
Well,
drop that down and out of the way.
That's some of them have that. It's more complicated on the machine, and I'm sure manufacturers like Delta and some of the bigger ones in Powermatic are cost conscious when it comes to stuff like that. If it's going to be another $10 for each saw, it's beyond their scope, you know.
Right.
So, but they have come a long way, and in the woodworking magazine world and publishing world, we've all been crying out for that for years to try and get manufacturers to take a look at their antiquated safety systems, especially their splitters. And they have, which is kind of good news. You know, it's a little late for you and me, but
yeah, it's definitely late for me, man. I'm out of the game.
But again, it's knowledge, I think, knowing how that kickback happens, knowing all the other potential dangers that you face when you turn and flip the switch on a table saw, keeps you, you know, in a more comfortable zone, and then that builds your confidence. And if you have the confidence, for me, it's like riding a motorcycle. If I don't have confidence, motorcycle riding is really, really dangerous. But if you have the confidence, all of a sudden you're in the flow. You're cornering with smoothness, and you enjoy what's going on. And when something happens, you're way more prepared to deal with it, like a piece of gravel on the corner or another car in your lane or what have you. The confidence goes a long way, but the knowledge comes first.
Yeah.
To gain that confidence.
I will say that whenever I'm in a wood shop, like you and I did a project together recently, we did some stuff for my shelves. And when I walk into a wood shop, it's like the one time I feel like I know what I'm doing.
Oh, that's nice.
You know, I did it for long enough.
Like home.
Yeah, it's just like I everything else, I usually have a tendency to get just to the point of confidence with something and then I quit. Like, I don't seem interested in fully mastering things, but I get highly competent and then I lose interest. And I don't know, you know, where in that gradient which comes first, but that has been the pattern. And every 10 years I've changed careers, including now I'm kind of, you know, starting to look at moving into this new world of stand-up comedy full time, which is ridiculous to consider.
From yoga eggs.
Yeah. At 46 years old, you know, I'm like, I think I'll become a traveling comic, you know, and live in hotels, and my peer group will be 20. And that's pretty much what I'm looking at. But I was talking to a friend of mine. He's like, that's an interesting concept, like changing careers every 10 years. He pointed it out to me. Like, he said, I've never known anybody to do that. Most people figure out what they want and they do it for the rest of their lives. And I always kind of admire people like that, like a lawyer or someone who gets good at something. That's what they do. They have their one hobby. Maybe they play guitar or golf or something, and they're content. And that is not me.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's a personality issue, but it's also, and for me, I guess my personality goes opposite in that I want to keep at something on and on until, not just until I get good at it, but so I can kind of flow with it, get beyond the good and be in that flow. But the other part of it that for me in woodworking is that there's no end to the learning.
Yeah.
It's constant, because I do custom work, one-off stuff. It's always something new, and I have to invent a new way to do something, or a new schedule, or find wood that's not commonly available in my area. Or like I did this 2 days ago, I spent 2 days milling a bunch of local sycamore with a friend with a chainsaw mill. 2 days of just back-breaking work out on a windy plain off of 70 near Swananoa. And it's rough work. You're handling planks that are like 200 to 300 pounds, and you're sawing them and then moving them and stacking them and then come back and sawing some more, and there's dust everywhere. In every pocket on your clothing is a pile of sawdust.
Right.
So it's hard on my body, and at my age, it's not something I would want to start as a career, but it's fun because I've done it before, but I haven't done a lot of it to where I could be good at it. So there's still that essence of, I'm learning a lot here, you know, and I'm probably screwing up here and there, but I'm learning from it. And that fun factor is there, as well as just making wood, you know, turning a log into lumber is just awesome.
Yeah.
You know, it's the very beginning of my craft. So it's something that I like to do. It's not something I want to do a lot of because it's backbreaking.
I feel that way about jointing a piece of wood.
Yeah.
Like, I love taking a warped, crooked piece of wood, and you learn how to read it, and then you learn how to hold it, and you learn how to make, you know, as efficiently as possible, because you want to maintain as much finished product as you can.
Yeah.
You know, to get that thing flat on one side and then
straight,
and then perpendicular to the edge so that you can, you know, cut it and plane it, and and I never get tired of that.
Yeah.
You know, I remember I loved it so much. I was like, I think I could go work in a lumberyard and like do this, and they were like, no.
Well, you could be the millman in a furniture shop. That's where you'd shine, because cabinet makers don't really deal with that. They deal with flat, ready-made pieces of plywood, and when they deal with wood, they're typically dealing with strips of wood, which can be then clamped to a nice, flat, straight piece of plywood, so they don't have to worry about being straight to begin with.
Right.
But furniture making always begins with milling, which is plain, pretty much joining on a joiner, which flattens and straightens edges, flattens faces, straightens edges, and then planing, and then sawing on the table saw or the bandsaw to get stuff to width. And that starts every project that I start with is that way, and I love it. I look like I like relished like getting a pile of wood, and it's a lot of work. It's heavy stuff at that point. They're usually long, big, thick planks in the beginning, but taking that stuff and knowing that I'm going to spend the day just smoothing. In terms of machine work, no handwork involved, just machining everything down till it's the size that I need and of a certain flatness is very satisfying work.
Well, I remember going back to your talking about, you know, just the learning and how you love the learning. And I remember when I was in your shop, the first time I was in your shop, I just was like, everywhere I looked was something that was exquisitely made, like your tool chest, which is just, I mean, that thing's a masterpiece. People who have the Vanderbilts don't have anything as nice in the Biltmore house as your tool chest.
Vanderbilt, Schmanderbilt.
So, I mean, but that's how beautiful that thing is. And so I just remember when I got there, when we met that first day, you know, I was like looking around, and everywhere I looked, I was like, can I open this drawer? You know, and then every drawer had treasures in it and stuff. And I remember saying to you, I said, you know, it's when it comes to woodworking, it's rare for me to meet someone that I can learn from. And I don't mean that to sound obnoxious. I just did enough time that I don't meet that many people whose skill level is that far beyond where mine was that I'm like, wow, I'm confronted with what I do not know right now. And your response was, really, it's too bad you feel that way. I feel like I can learn something from everyone. And I felt, you know, this big.
Well, that hits because I think you're expressing like-mindedness more than anything. Your mind works a lot like mine. We're both somewhat anal retentive. We like to be highly organized.
I prefer the phrase detail-oriented.
Okay,
that's
like
fine. We can use. You can be anal retentive.
Whatever.
I'm going to be detail-oriented.
We're together on this, dude. So, but we're meticulous. You know, we're fussy about things, and then so when you build a little drawer and it has some little curved dovetails in it, it's like, oh, this is a chance to just shine that meticulousness, you know, and make it pop. And we're also visual artists. We like to see what we're looking at. We would like to see stuff that has that degree of attention to detail, or anal attention. I'm not sure what that is.
Anal attention.
Anal attention. Right. But yeah, that piece, the tool cabinet, was a labor of love. I like to say it took 7 years, because I was in that shop, Bill Draper's shop, building custom work for Bill. And I had a bunch of mahogany. Most of the tool cabinet was mahogany with some curly maple and some ebony accents and stuff. And I designed the cabinet, and I saw a friend of mine had built a similar cabinet with the basic style is box style doors, where you open up the doors and there's stuff inside the doors themselves as well as in the cabinet. And I love that idea of gaining that extra storage space in the doors themselves. So I designed it and cut out all the parts, and it sat for 7 years. And 5 years after that, I left Bill and started my own business full time back on Edel Farm in Princeton. And a couple of years after that, I was running out of work, and I had this pile of beautiful mahogany and maple sitting there. And I said, screw this, I'm going to finish the damn thing. And I put it together. It took a couple of months to put it together, which was, you know, all the joinery and all the finishing and all that stuff. So it was, you know, I called it a 7-year cabinet. And it was, you know, my wife at the time looked at me and said, why are you doing this? This is just so over the top. You know, you need to be working. And I was doing it, I think, foremost because it was a labor of love. It was a design exercise, which, you know, turns me on. But also, it turns out, over the years, it became a really good advertising piece, because a customer would walk into the shop and they'd see that and say, oh, and they'd be talking about something they wanted, and they wanted a style of joinery or a look, and I could point to aspects of the cabinet that had some of those details, like fine English style dovetails or hidden access panels and leather line, this and that, and tool holding, ways to hold implements and tools. So it's been great. I don't regret the 7 years or really the 2 or 3 months I put into it.
No, I would think, I remember, when somebody sees something like that and they're hiring you to, or considering hiring you to build something that they're going to care about, and they see, wow, he put this much attention into his tool chest. Yeah. Imagine what he's going to do for me. Yeah. Like that to me.
Well, we're back to your original statement of how there really just aren't a lot of people out there who appreciate attention to detail. And so that's the crux of it for me, is that my best customers over the years are the people that I had. One guy I built a library for, a very detailed library with inlays and hidden drawers and all kinds of electronic and electrical plugs and this and that. And he was fascinated by the idea of building this. And every Saturday he came over. He lived pretty close to me. He came over with his son to my shop. And he spent about an hour just hanging out to see how it was going. And he wasn't keeping tabs on me. He was trying to absorb the idea of making stuff, and he wanted his son to get in on that too and experience this. And that was the kind of appreciation that made that kind of job worthwhile, because he really knew what he was getting. Maybe he didn't know it to the degree I knew what he was getting, but he appreciated it. And the customer has all the money in the world, and you build them a table, or maybe you never meet them. You ship a table out to Taos, or right. out to California somewhere, or to Australia. It doesn't carry that type of appreciation when you're done with the job. It's like, it's just, that's some money in the bank. I can pay my bills, but I don't even know this guy, and they don't seem to appreciate what they got. So it's tough. I mean, it's not just a matter about finding people who have money to build, to buy fine furniture, but it's really about finding people who appreciate good woodwork. And, some poor people like that, or middle income people like that. They're willing to scrimp and save and not get the brand new car because they'd rather have a piece that they know they can hand down to their kids and their family for generations. It's what I call heirloom furniture. It's not, the chair from IKEA that's designed to last 5 years and then it's going to be thrown away and you got to buy a new one.
I had a crazy kind of like bizarre karma story that happened like that. When I moved to LA after college, and I was living at home, and my dad's like, you've got to do something to help cover the cost of having you in this house. He's like, you don't have to pay rent, but you have to pay for the $200 of food that you eat every month or something, something. You can't just live here for nothing. So after, getting jobs, I was an artist at the time. I was painting in the garage, and
that was a 10-year stint?
I wish. I think it lasted about 6 years. But in order to support myself as an artist, I started working as a woodworker, because I had a job in this cafe, and what happened was I would drink coffee and eat sugar until midnight, and then I wasn't allowed to paint in the garage because there was a guest house next to it, and the guy, I would wake him up. And so after Cheers was over, I wasn't allowed to paint anymore. That was our thing. Like, I would hear the song, Sometimes You Want to Go, like the second time they played it, and then I knew my night was done. And so when I was working at the cafe, I would get home too late, and then I was wired on caffeine and sugar. I'd stay up till 5 a.m. watching movies, back before there was Netflix or anything interesting to watch. Then I'd sleep till 2 and start work at 4. So I wasn't painting, and I hated this job. And I quit with almost no notice, I would have stayed as long as they wanted, but they knew it wasn't working for anybody. So anyway, I got a job woodworking with this guy named Kurt Gary. He had a shop called Kurt Craft, both with a K. And really nice guy, super temperamental. I mean, this guy would go from 0 to screaming over nothing, and it was terrifying. He's a little tiny guy, but he was just, he was the boss. It was freaking terrifying when he would get this mad. I almost developed an ulcer in the 4 days that I worked for him. But he was an amazing craftsman, and there's a couple pieces to this story. One is that I had a sense, I was so new that everything he did looked like a miracle to me.
Yeah.
And so I thought that he did everything perfectly. And when I opened my own shop, I learned how to do everything perfectly. No nail holes. No. By the time I was done, I wasn't using nail guns. Everything was biscuited.
Right.
Everything was blind joints. I mean, they're biscuits instead of fancy stuff that you furniture makers do, which reminds me of
Morrison Tennant.
Yeah, I'll never forget. As an aside, when I was looking at something and you were building this little table with drawers. Let's see if you remember this, and you were locating the drawer face on the thing, and I said, they make these really great drawer front adjusters, and you turned to me and said, "You're such a cabinet maker."
I do remember.
That was the first time I felt insulted for being a cabinet maker.
That's definitely a Jason Scholder move.
Well, that was an Andy Ray move. Are
sure,
you kidding?
sure.
Well, I'm used to going on a job site, and the cabinet maker is revered by the house carpenters, and here I was, thought I was bonding with you, and you so insulted me. You meant it. No, it was playful. It wasn't mean, but it was just I'd never felt inadequate as a cabinet maker before, let alone a reasonably skilled one. So anyway, that was a very fun moment for me in our friendship. So I had the sense that Kurt did everything perfectly, and I made it a point to do everything perfectly. And then I went back to his shop 5 years later.
With knowledge.
And saw he had nail holes, he had filler, he had joints that didn't line up. I mean, he still did really good work. And ultimately, his skills continue to outshine mine. But I realized, good enough is way lower than what I thought good enough was. My level of what was good enough was untenable for most people. It just didn't need to be that good. And even one of the best cabinet makers in town, which he was, still didn't do work that was that insanely detailed, because you could never survive. So anyway, I was in there one day, and he was working on something really phenomenal. He had a hinge that was on a wire that wove through not a hinge, a latch. It was on a wire that wove through the whole cabinet and then unlatched, so you could unlatch the cabinet doors from the side of the cabinet.
Cool.
I forget why it had to be like that, but it did. And it was for an architect named Marmol and Radziner. They're a top architect and designer in LA. And their client was Tom Ford, who's also a designer. And Tom Ford, his family owned the house that I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I lived there for 5 years. When we moved to New Mexico, the first 2 or 3 years we lived there, we lived in this really cool old adobe house. And his family had owned that, his grandmother or something. When I was a kid, he babysat for me. And so then fast forward, 15 years or something like that, this cabinet maker that I'm working for, at this point it's probably 20 years later, the cabinet maker that I used to work for is building things for Tom Ford, and Tom Ford had since moved back into that house. So when I went back to Santa Fe with my girlfriend at the time, we went to the house, and his partner met us at the bottom of the driveway and wouldn't let us come any further because Tom was inside working. and then when he told him who I was, he was like, "Oh my God, I would love to have seen him. I used to babysit that kid." But anyway, furniture that Kurt made in LA was now in my old house in Santa Fe. And this is I certainly didn't put that together. How in the world does that happen? And these were people, Tom and Marmol and Radziner, those guys really did appreciate that level of craftsmanship. And so Kurt was the guy who got hired to do that kind of stuff. And he was very fortunate in that,
The idea, it's a sliding scale of knowing what's good and what's not so good, or what's mediocre and what rises above. In other words, your sense of that is different from the next guy's, and that makes it a complicated issue when you're trying to design something that for somebody that wants a certain thing. And I think for me it comes down to, they're going to get not what I like, but they're going to get Andy Ray. They're going to get me in that piece, because here's my sliding scale. This is what I think is appropriate for this piece of furniture. And it's interesting you use the word cabinet maker, because one of my other teachers was Frank Klaus, who's a master. Well, he's a master cabinet maker. You can call him a master woodworker, but he would call himself a cabinet maker. And the difference here is that he was trained in Europe. He's Hungarian. His father was a cabinet maker. His father was a cabinet maker. And he came over here in his 20s and started his business and was very successful, and is still successful today. He subsequently has sold his shop, but he's now doing videos and teaching and this and that, and he's still building stuff. But I remember, and I used to work for him for a little while in his shop. I was moonlighting from another wood shop, and I remember him. He had a bunch of guys that worked for him, all men, which is typical. And a customer was making a comment. I forget how the scene went, but basically Frank turned around in very Hungarian accent and very Hungarian vehemence. He's a very strong-willed and strong-spoken man. Said, he was talking about, the customer was talking about one of his workers, and Frank puffed up his chest and said, "He's a cabinet maker. He's not a woodworker. He's a cabinet maker." And for Frank, that meant he could do anything. And when he meant cabinets, he meant not kitchen cabinets and not plywood, but corner cabinets with arched doorways and inlays of satin wood and all kinds of fancy stuff and hand-cut dovetails. That's what a cabinet maker was and is to a old European woodworker.
So that's what you meant when you said that about me?
I'm American, dude. I lived in Europe, but no, I'm sorry.
I've been to Europe.
But it's the American. So I don't call myself a cabinet maker because it's in this country. It's not the same thing. It's a step down on that sliding scale in terms of performance or execution or the end product. Cabinet making involves lots of plywood for the most part. And it's a good way to make a living. It's a really hard way to make a living the way Frank did it. But Frank was hobnobbing with all the big people in New York City, and he did some stuff from the West Coast too, but he was really in touch with a lot of the top designers and architects and millionaires in his area. He was in Plaquemine, New Jersey, not far from Princeton, and a stone's throw from the city in New York. So he was and still is what I would call one of the most successful woodworkers I know, because he bought his house, built a building behind it, and has a swimming pool, has 2 kids that he put through college. All his bills are paid, and built a shop and subsequently sold it as he retired in his later years. So I don't know what the measure of his success is, or maybe how he became that, but I think part of it was Frank's attitude of his sliding scale was higher than mine, and one that I aspired to, that everything he did was excellent, and there were no corners to be cut. Now, that's not to say that there aren't corners to be cut every day in terms of getting it out the door, but you don't make that corner, you don't cut the corner where the customer will then see that corner. If it's a corner that's cut, it's something that no one ever knows about. It just gets the work done faster. So it's possible, but he's the rare exception in my world of successful woodworkers. And I think part of it is what Frank would say, is that if he got to be known as anything, he got to be known as expensive. And I remember hearing friends talk about him that didn't know that I knew him. Oh, that Frank Claus, he's really expensive. And it's kind of a disheartening thing for me, because I'd love to build furniture for my friends, but at the same time, it's a realistic view, because that winnows out all those people coming in to look for something, a table that's a $5,000 dining table, and they want it for $500.
Yeah. And
not that I can't do that, I can, but it's not what I'm aiming for. It's not my scale that I strive for.
Yeah, I had a friend, I have a bunch of furniture downstairs that I built. It's all for sale because I built it just to sell it. But it's neat stuff, and everything's different, and it's all part of this whole Friday furniture idea, which, remind me, I'll explain it to you. And a friend of mine wanted to buy, she said, I saw you have like a little piano bench. I wanted to put something like that in my house. She has a rental house. And I said, all right, well, let me figure out what I was selling it for. And so I think I was selling it for $450, and she's a friend of mine. I said, you can have it for $300, and she said, oh yeah, no, I can't afford that. And I was like, well, what was your expectation?
Yeah.
I mean, she said, I don't know. I know I can't afford $300. I said, okay, well, it's a handmade piece. That's probably about what I have in it, Yeah. And so I was really just liquidating it as far as I'm concerned. But no big deal. We didn't have a long conversation about it. But it's just this thing that people don't understand, that if something's handmade, it takes time,
Yeah.
And I remember this guy wanted me to customize some stuff that Ethan Allen had. And he's like, I saw the stuff at Ethan Allen, but I wanted to do this and not that and that and not this, and can you do that for me? And I said, yeah, sure. And we did it together. We went to Ethan Allen together and, looked at their designs and then took the elements and made what he wanted. And then when I gave him the price, he's like, well, for that much, I could just get it at Ethan Allen. I'm like, then I underbid it because this should be more than Ethan Allen. I mean, you're getting a custom-made
handmade
thing. Yeah, handmade item. And he just thought that because he hired some guy with a garage shop that it should be cheaper than a store. And
Frank, the guy walked into Frank's shop one day and he looked at this chair and said, "Oh, I'd like that chair. How much is that chair?" And Frank gave him a price, and the guy was shocked at the price of one chair. It was, thousands, not even hundreds. And he said, "Well," and he's kind of bald. He was coming from New York, he's kind of ballsy and pushy. And he said, "Well, what if I order 10? Will you give me a better price?" And Frank at this point was pissed off, and rightfully said, "I'm going to charge you more for 10 because at that point we're doing this over and over and it's all handwork and we're going to get bored to tears and it's going to cost us more. So no, you're going to pay more if you want 10." Wow. So there's some truth to that. It's not just a gut reaction. I think it's about the fact that this is not factory work. We don't set up and just ream off millions of board feet of wood. We set up our machines and make a cut because it's very specific to that piece of furniture. And then we break down that machine and make a new setup for a whole nother scenario. And it costs time. It takes us time to do that, to do it by hand. In a factory, there's one machine that does the same thing over and over, day in, day out, 365 days a year. And that just doesn't happen when you're making it by hand. Whether or not you're using machines or hand tools isn't even the issue. It's just that it's handmade, meaning we're figuring out how to do every little thing all the time. And it takes time, and time needs to be charged for. Yeah. I wish there was an easier way. I wish we could all make furniture for the masses, but that experiment's been tried and it's pretty much failed by some English makers many, many moons ago who wanted to do the same thing. So it's just, I get stuck with that. I really am in a point in my career where I'd love to be able to be like the village woodworker. Your kids need a new stool, and Farmer Joe needs a milking stool, and this guy needs a bed, and it doesn't happen. And at the same time, I'm committed to the idea of making really fine things, because I think if our world doesn't have that, we're losing something. If we're going to strive for mediocrity to where everybody can have the same thing, then what's the point? And that's, there's something good about that. There's a survivalist mentality about that. We can all get along and survive if we all have something that's common and available. And if we have really fine things, then we're feeding the 1%. But I think we're also feeding the idea of art in the world. And in the long run, art saves lives, in my book. Just having been out there doing something that you think is the best that you can do breeds a sense of wonder and beauty and a desire to have a nicer world than the one we live in. And there's something really good about that to me. It's the art side of me, the artist side, which is really my background.
I remember when my daughter was born, her mom and I, we weren't planning to have this child. But when, we found out we were pregnant and, we spent some time reevaluating our relationship and decided to live together and, try to make it happen as a family. And it worked for as long as it worked. We were together for 6 years. And it was really important to me that we lived in this house. I mean, the house is really beautiful. It's really homey. But I really wanted my daughter more than anything to grow up around my furniture. I wanted her to be, and my artwork's all over the walls, and artwork from other people that I've bought who I used to represent. It's not like not like they paid me in paintings. I invested in these artists if I liked their work. But most of the stuff in the house is stuff I built. And I really wanted her to grow up from the very beginning being around things that were made by hand and made by me.
By humans.
Yeah, and knowing that, like, oh, that's a thing. Like, making something and having it be beautiful, and you were touching on this earlier, functional, and it has to be both of those things. Like woodworking, that's one of the reasons it was cool to evolve from painting to woodworking for me, there were a few things about that.
Utility aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that was responsible for more.
Yeah.
With the painting, you're just responsible for what it looks like, and that you don't mix the paints in the wrong way that they fall off. You can't put water on top of oil, or it'll peel. Once you get past that, it's mostly aesthetic. But with the furniture, it's got to look nice, it's got to work, and it's got to last. So there's a lot going on that has to happen. Yeah. And so I just really, to your point you've been making for a little bit, it was very important to me that my daughter grew up in a house filled with handmade things. Her mom's more into antiques, which is fine. I mean, their family collects antiques, and there's a virtue to that. I don't love antiques myself for a few different reasons, but I said, well, we can have some, but I want to make sure she's mostly around stuff that I made. And so my dresser, she has a dresser that I made in her room. I mean, for an 8-year-old to have a $5,000 dresser is ridiculous, but that's what that thing's worth, or maybe more. I don't even know.
Sure.
Anymore,
Sure.
But it's like, and when she's mad, she slams the drawers. I'm like, you can't slam those drawers.
Well, she's learning about that too.
You're not allowed to have an 8-year-old tantrum on a adult dresser. Save that for the closet. You've got stuff in the closet you can bang around. But yeah, I mean, so it's true. I mean, she's learning some appreciation for that. But I remember that being really important to me.
What is that? What is Sula learning? What does it give her in life? This idea of growing up around handmade and human-made things.
Well, we had a really funny conversation. I have this whole series on Facebook. I don't know if you've seen it, called Sula Said.
Oh yeah, I love it.
And I have these conversations with her. And one of the very first ones, maybe the first one that I wrote down and published, was, she said, did you build this house? And I said, no. I said, I didn't build a house. I said, I built the furniture in the house. And she's like, so were you Bob the Builder? And I said, I'm not Bob the Builder, but I was, Jason the furniture maker. And she said, so were you my daddy? And I said, well, I wasn't your daddy then, and I didn't know I was going to be your daddy one day, but I'm your daddy now. And she's like, you didn't really know who you were back then, did you, daddy? And she was like at 3 or 4 years old. And that was when I knew, like, I had this kid who was putting things together. I mean, it was such a profound comment, because I certainly didn't know who I was back then in the much more self-actualized way, and the lack thereof. So.
And since then, I imagine, too, that all of us become more attuned to looking for... It's not looking for handmade furniture. It's looking for stuff that's beyond and outside and more local than the corporate world and the corporate factory and the made in China and the made in Taiwan scene that we've had now for years and years. And there seems to me be a sense of people wanting to get back in touch with their roots, which is local food, local furniture, anything. That doesn't mean it has to be here in Asheville, but it's still something that's made and created by a group of people and not a corporation, and not strictly by machines or designed by machine. So which is good. I think it's a great thing to have. It's just hard for me, it's like juggling that idea with the idea of getting work. Come over to my shop, I'll show you handmade, but it's going to be expensive. It's going to cost some money. But I think we're closer to that than we ever have been in terms of people wanting something that has value beyond the moment. It's not this instant gratification thing. It's this long-term investment in your life in terms of something that you're buying or acquiring.
I was hanging out with one of my comic friends the other night, and his door, someone knocked at the door, and he got up to get the door, and he put his foot down too close to his chair, and it snapped the cross rails on the chair. And he's like, well, that's what I get for buying stuff at IKEA, and he could replace that chair tomorrow with the exact same chair, and no one would know.
Yeah.
And it really was. I mean, that wood looked like, I don't know, ash or some kind of thing. It looked like it was wood. It wasn't particle board, but it kind of looked like it was just pressed together to look like wood. I mean, it was very, very seemingly lacking in integrity and structure.
Yeah. Well, it's economics. They design, the big companies are designing stuff on it. It's a bean counting situation where they can shave an 1/8 inch of wood from something and save $100 over the course of running 1,000 pieces. So they do it. And the average chair is just not going to last more than 5 years. Yeah. It's going to fall apart one way or the other, because that's one of the pieces of furniture that gets the most abuse anyway. It's hard. My hat's off to chair makers. It's not something that I really have gotten into, because it's a really exacting craft. Trying to design something that's not only beautiful and ergonomically comfortable, but strong enough and at the same time light enough in its members to be successful visually and not fall apart in 100 years or more. Or if they design it right, which is another thing that I got from George Nakashima, is to make it so that when it needs repair, it's easily repairable. It's not some epoxied together piece of stuff that is impossible to take apart and re-glue or repair, and add it, strengthen up the joints or whatever it might need. And that's part of design too. And that's kind of planned obsolescence in a way from factory furniture, where once it starts to go, it goes. It's gone. There's nothing you can do with it.
I mean, I IKEA. I have friends who are always like, "Oh, I'm going to IKEA. Do you want anything?" I'm like, I don't ever want anything from IKEA. The only thing I ever bought from there were the furniture pads that you'd bang onto the bottom of a stool or a chair so they don't scratch your floor. And they had some hangers that I bought. I was like, those are the only two things I'm willing to buy from that store.
Don't tell anybody. I've got an IKEA bookcase in my house, and I love it.
You just told
everybody. You
everybody.
didn't hear that. Nobody heard that.
Yeah, we won't broadcast
But,
that.
there are things. IKEA's always fascinated me. I remember they first opened a store in King of Prussia, outside of Philadelphia, and we went at the time, and we were just fascinated by walking the aisles, all this stuff. But I look at it as a furniture maker with a furniture maker's eye, so I'm looking for things that are designed well, where they can withstand certain treatments. And most of their kitchen work, forget it. But you could take their kitchen boxes, put them in your house, and then cover them up with handmade wooden doors and drawers, and you might have a really nice system. But in general, I'm not a big fan of particle board and thin veneers and Scandinavian softwoods.
Everything from IKEA is inherently thinner than it ought to be, because it's all going to be shipped over from Sweden.
Yeah.
And so everything's 5/8 instead of 3/4,
right.
and it just inherent in that is it's just not going to last.
Yeah.
And
the prices should give you a clue as to what's going on. That's where the general public gets hoodwinked. I think they think, oh, well, it costs $50 for a chair, $55 for an armchair,
right?
And I got buddies down the road they're making chairs for $3,000, and they're really nice chairs, and they're super comfortable and they'll last for generations. And something that woodworkers can help with, and most of them. Well, there's a problem with a lot of woodworkers, and especially young ones, and in this area too, because we're just brimming with woodworkers in the Asheville area. Is that they'll talk to a customer and talk about a piece, and then give them a price, and they're basing that price on the fact that they think the customer will buy it at that price, and they're basing it also on the fact that they know they're going to make $5 to $10 an hour if they get that price, and they're happy to do it because it gets them work, gets their name out there, and they're busy. And I understand that, and I don't want to take away work from anybody, but what that does is it's educating our customers to expect the $50 chair,
right.
And that's a problem. I don't think you go to a country where you have a lot more handmade work, like France or Belgium or Germany or almost any European country where there's a history of the craft, and nobody expects a $50 chair. If they do, they know exactly what they're buying. They're buying a chair that's going to last for a few years,
right?
And that's fine. But this customer is not expecting that. They're expecting, this is going to be a really nice chair for $50, and then they come to my shop and they say, "Here's this design. We got this from another woodworker, and what do you think and how much?" And I look at it as, well, it's a good design, and it's probably a $600 chair. And they walk out saying, "God, that guy's expensive." And they unfortunately don't come back because they're not educated about the real cost of furniture.
Yeah.
And I think that idea can be translated across the board in all kinds of stuff that we make and sell, and not just artists, but any kind of craft, even machinists. So educating the public, I think, just being realistic about what it takes to make a specific piece of furniture. And that's simple. It's a matter of time and materials. You sit down. If you have any experience, you gauge your time. This is going to take me 45 hours, and there's going to be $600 worth of material in it. And you've got a price, and maybe you put 10 or 20% on top of that to try and keep your business floating and make a profit. And you get this price that sounds horrible to a lot of young furniture makers because it's really, really high to what they expect. And it's a tough nut to sell. I think over time we educate our customers by being realistic about the prices of what it takes to make furniture.
So I thought we'd switch gears a little bit, if you're amenable to that. We've talked profession, and I thought it might be nice to talk about our personal lives a little bit, to the degree that that's comfortable. Feel free to not go anywhere you don't want to go. Sure. But what's your situation now? Are you married? Were you married? I mean, tell me a little bit about how you moved to Asheville.
Situation. What's your situation?
Is that a good pickup line?
It is.
What's your
awesome.
situation?
Yeah, what's the situation? It's like this. Lee and I, my ex, I'm actually still married technically, but she's definitely an ex. We moved here with our two kids in 99 we came down to try and move and find a house. And it was impossible. And it's, Asheville's only gotten worse since then. And it took us a year to find a really weird house. Nice house, but it was weird out in Leicester, pretty far out, surrounded by Baptists. And so we moved down, and I made it. At the time I was freelancing. I'd been working at American Woodworking magazine at Rodale Press, and we lived outside of the Allentown area in Glen Hartsville, which is in Berks County, the county over from Lehigh County. And I'd freelanced for a year and had started writing my first book for a publisher, for Taunton Press, and done some other freelance work, writing type of work, not a whole lot of woodwork. And we wanted to move. Lee was from Mississippi originally. I'm originally from the north, from New Jersey and Pennsylvania area, although I spent 8 years of my young life on an island called Bequia in the West Indies. Went to boarding school in Barbados for a couple of years, and then went to boarding school in England for 4 years to finish up schooling. But anyway, we figured something mid-south would be really cool, and I didn't have any aspirations to move into the deep south, into Louisiana or Mississippi or any of those states. It's a little too southern for me. But I was more than ready to move from the Northeast. So we took a trip, probably in 98 or so, through North Carolina. And she had some family here in Kannapolis, kind of a race car family, and a sister living in the Durham area. So we visited there in Kannapolis. And as soon as I got into North Carolina, I hated it. It was just flat, scrubby pines, yellow pines, and lots of Baptists.
So you must have been in the eastern part of the state.
Yeah, this is all Durham and up to Charlotte, And a friend said, you really should get up to Asheville. And I'd heard that from other friends over the years. And I'd made an appointment to visit a box maker here. So we drove up after visiting other people in the flatlands, as I call them. We drove up the hill, and as soon as we both got to Asheville, we both were just enthralled by the sense of the town and the mountains and the geography and the artistic sense that was going on, and said, yeah, this is the place, let's move here. And it took us a year to get here to find a house, and I also I was dead set against just coming here and trying to look for work. So one of the tenets that I'd been told that I tell people since is, if you come into Asheville, bring a job. So I did. I hooked up with Lark Books, who was then in town at that point in a publishing venue on College Street, in the corner of College and Rankin. And I said, here's my experience, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, oh, great, a woodworking editor and a male, like a man, instead of all the women that are in here at Lark Books. This will be great. I said, well, I'll give you 2 years. And they said, well, if you give us 2 years, we'll give you 2 years. We'll make a commitment for 2 years. I said, that's cool. So we made the move, and I started at Lark Books. And after 2 years, it was just fine for me to move on. Very matriarchal environment. Fun, but not. I basically came from a really highly organized publication or publishing house, which is Rodale Press, which has since changed since my day there, but and moved to Lark Books, which is very parochial, and the woodworking side of things was full of flaws and all kinds of weird stuff going on. And so I was hired basically to come in and start the woodworking division and get a whole bunch of woodworking books out. And it was a struggle for me to do that. We published a bunch of books. I wrote another book while I was there. In fact, I finished up my Taunton book while I was a Lark employee, which was kind of weird for them, but fine for me. And after 2 years, I said that's enough, and moved on and just started my own woodworking business in my house in Leicester. I had a nice walkout basement at the time, and started on a third book at that point, which for me involves, it's not really so much writing as it is organizing a book in terms of chapters and headings, and then doing all the photography myself, which is a huge investment of time. And then really making a bunch of woodworking props to show what I needed to show in photos. So it's an exercise in woodworking without actually making anything when you're making a woodworking book, unless you're doing something that's from start to finish, like a bunch of projects. But basically, the books that I've written are technique books. So they involve, taking shots of techniques, and then you've got all these pieces of wood lying around at the end of it that don't amount to much of anything, which is kind of disheartening. It's not making furniture; it's making a book, which is different, which is good too. So anyway, that went on for a while until we decided to get the hell out of that house, and we bought a house in Beaver Dam, in a really beautiful area at the end of Beaver Dam, and we were there for about 6 years. And at one point, I had an architect friend design a wood shop for me on my property. But in the interim, I met, I was already met up with Gabe Alcott, who is and continues to be one of Asheville's most premier woodworkers. He's been voted, I think, 3 times the most favorite woodworker in the Mountain Express poll every year. And he introduced me to Jan Durr, who was working on the top floor of the Film Mechanic Studios, the Film Mechanic building. And in 3,000 square feet. And then Gabe moved up there and was working with him as well. And I said, I'd rather be, involved in a community sense and scene rather than stuck out in my wood shop, my beautiful little wood shop in Beaver Dam. I'm gonna forego building a shop and just move in with these guys, which I did. And we were all there for 4 or 5 years. At the very end of which, I was there. I had the whole space by myself at the end, but the building, like everything going on in the River Arts District and in Asheville in general, the prices kept going up, and Jolene and Mitch Mechanic had to raise the rent, so I had to move on. What happened next? Well, then I moved. I should preface this by saying I'm in my 14th shop now. So this was probably and I think I've had 7 different studios in Asheville itself. But anyway, from the Film Mechanic Studios, which I call the PMS, because it's been run by women for years. I moved to an awesome location on Lexington, South Lexington, at Brown's Auto, which is now a glass studio.
Yeah, I remember that.
And that was just the sweetest shop. I paired up with a buddy, Aaron Murray, and in the back end of we didn't have the whole building. The back end was another glass artist doing his work. And that lasted a couple of years. And then it got to be where, after 23 years of marriage to Lee, I decided it just wasn't working for me. And if it wasn't working for me, I don't think it's going to work for my kids. And that was a tough decision. I decided to separate. And that was years of agonizing to go through that. And through therapy as well. And so I kind of did this trial separation of a couple months to see how it would go. I moved out. And in the interim of that, my son, who was then 19, Zai Ray, crashed his motorcycle into a car that pulled out in front of him on Beaver Dam Road, a big Suburban. and he died on the road.
Oh, God.
And subsequently, his mom, we had a wonderful wake and funeral. I had his body home for 3 days in his bed, which was very cool. We had 2 Buddhist ladies showed up that managed all of that through the hospital and what have you. And we had a wonderful service for him. And then basically Lee wigged out on me and kind of went crazy and was already having a really hard time with the separation, and for me to like just trying to get a hold of my girl, we switched back and forth with my at that time 12-year-old daughter Shade, and I'd show up to pick her up and she wouldn't get out of the car, and she'd have Zai deliver Shade to me, and it became pretty tense for her. And after Zai's death, I think she broke down. And she basically started poisoning Shade against me as a father, and called me a bad father and all this stuff in front of her. And so that kind of split and shut the doors to my family, which at that point was just my daughter. And that was almost 7 years ago, and I haven't seen or heard from my daughter since. So I'm hoping someday she'll just kind of wake up and kind of ask me what's up, because she's never had the chance to talk to me about any of that. But in the meantime, I've tried not to be. I didn't take the aggressor route of hiring a lawyer and try and fight for my daughter, because I felt all that would do would be to harm her mom, and I didn't want to do that. And I hired a mediation lawyer, and I also went to the Asheville court system twice to work with their mediation people, and none of that worked for various reasons. But a lot of it because the Asheville court system is pretty fucked. So I've tried calling her, but I don't have a phone number. I don't have an address. I think they've moved to somewhere outside of Mobile, Alabama, according to a friend who saw them on Facebook. But other than that, I've no contact with her. So it's been rough as a family guy. It's been hard, but juxtaposed with all that, and probably about a month or so before Zai passed, I met Jessica, who was living in Asheville, and we totally fell in love, and we've been together for almost 7 years. So she's just kind of the opposite of my ex. It's very loving, very unassuming, kind, not much of an ego. So it's just kind of the tonic that I need in a relationship. So we still love each other very much, and we love spending time together, and she loves walking in the woods, and we both don't make a whole lot of money, so we're similar there. And she's used to living poor, so that's been a good lesson for me. And she's got a great brother who lives in town. He's a landscaper, Joshua Reeves. And her mom is up all the time from Greenville, North Carolina, visiting us. So it's been good. That's been kind of a lifesaver for me, and it's kept me out of the really dark woodwork that was coming after me, after the whole family debacle. What else can I say about that? You need to interject at this point.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't dream of.
It's a sad tale.
Well, it's okay for things to be. It's okay for things to be real, and I mean, it's incredibly sad. I mean, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I have a at the moment increasingly dissonant relationship with her mom, and we're all hoping that we get through this. But we're pretty good about not talking smack about the other parent. I mean, just when you said that about happening, I mean, that's the worst thing a parent can do.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's a lot of horrible things a parent can do. One of the worst things a parent can do in the split family situation is to talk trash about the other parent. I mean, you just it doesn't help the kid at all. And it's listening to you tell the story. I mean, it's just, I cannot imagine a world where I didn't have my daughter. I don't mean to drive that home
No, it's true.
to you.
It's
I mean,
true.
I just can't imagine
It's
it.
just personalities. I'm just one of those types of people that I can't do that. I mean, I think that's what makes me a father. I couldn't do anything to hurt my kids. And I'm sure I have. We all do things as parents that inadvertently hurt our kids, but it's because we're unaware for the most part. We're not doing it intentionally. But when vindictiveness comes into play, that's like you need to just keep your emotions in check, because if they're going to affect your kids, you're hurting your kids.
Yeah.
And I can't. Yeah, that's just a whole other scenario for me. I can't deal with that. But I think that happens a lot. I think since then I've of course have read and researched and met tons of people that have been in similar situations to mine. It's not uncommon. And it's also very common for not just the general public, but even the court system, especially in Asheville, and child services in Asheville, to side with the mother in terms of what's going on. And I've seen my brunt of that in terms of how I've been treated as like a derelict dad, and all kinds of stuff. She took me to court for violence at one point. I've never hit a person in my life. The worst thing I've ever done was probably kick a fridge and stub my toe. And her woman lawyer was there to help bolster her argument. And the woman judge showed up, and I thought, oh my God, I'm so screwed. And she listened to Lee's statement and her lawyer's statement, and both of those, she told them to keep it down, please, no shouting. And she listened to my statement, and she looked up and said, there's no violence here. Stick around if you want a copy of the report. And I didn't. But it's common. It's a very common
Well, that's
thing.
got to be hugely liberating, though. I mean...
It is. But it was just a ploy by her to try and, put me down. I think what she was trying to do was distance everything about me from her. Yeah. The ironic part is she's got a house full of furniture that she essentially stole, because my house in Beaver Dam, I had to break into my house 3 times to try and get stuff that I needed to live. I was living down in Old Fort, a place called Weaseltown, for a year with Jessica, and then it was all gone, and she packed it all up, and $35,000 pantry and chests of drawers, you name it. Some of that stuff came back to me years later, a few years ago, I think because she felt she had more stuff that had me on it and in it, right. And she didn't want it around, but none of the good furniture came back. So it's a sad situation. It's selfishness. It's not thinking beyond your own self and your own. We all hurt, and we're all in pain. All of us are struggling to survive. Every single one of us, even Donald Trump. But to think in terms of, in terms of that, and be selfish about it, and not think of your neighbor at the same time, is just selfishness. And I don't abide by it. I mean, it's not that easy to be. You don't have to be selfless, but it's not that easy. It's not hard to be compassionate and caring and have some type of sensitivity to the people around you. Yeah. It's just called empathy. So there's a certain psychotic aspect to this, I think, in a medical term. And the therapists and psychiatrists that I've talked to agreed with me about that whole situation. So it's been rough. It's tough for me because it really takes the wind out of your sails in so many ways. And really 2 things keep me going, Jessica. Number 1, and my woodworking, my undying love of woodworking keeps me sane. I get into the shop. I get enthralled by, I'll spend 6 hours cutting dovetails all day long and be totally absorbed in it. And then I might stop and look up and remember my other life and have a moment of sadness. But then I get back to work or go hang with my girl.
Well, it's key to have that. I mean,
yeah.
Some people don't. They don't have an anchor.
Yeah.
And that sounds like you've got 2, which is nice. Yeah. One waiting at home and one waiting. Well, I don't know if she's waiting.
Oh, she is. No, she is. She's that kind of person.
Yeah.
I do the same for her. I wait for her.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I think about the failures in my life, I think the longest list of failures are my relationships. There's just an endless number of them, I mean.
Well, and when I met this lady, the first one, I knew. It's not like I didn't know. I knew there was trouble, that if I ever crossed her, there would be trouble, because that was her personality. And I also, in a funny way, I knew that she wasn't my cup of tea, but that I'd get on a ride that I'd never ridden before. And that really drew me in. She was from a different area, she's from a wealthy family in Mississippi. She had, drive, and she had a different way of being. She was very we were a bunch of artists living on Edel Farm in Princeton, New Jersey when she showed up, and she was just the opposite of all of us. It's like, oh, that's interesting to me. And, in retrospect, which is the sharpest form of clarity, but it doesn't do you any good, I can look at that and say, that's not the kind of woman that I'm looking for. I'm looking for really kind of a plain Jane. I call Jessica plain Jane sometimes. She hates it, and I'm sorry, but it's true. It's like she's not looking to break the world record. She's not focused on money. She's not focused on fame or ego or notoriety. She's just, she's a regular person.
Yeah.
Beautiful and beautiful inside, in and out. So, if I could look back and say, if I was 28 or 29 again, I'd have different priorities. But that's how we learn. We learn, again, learning from failing. This was a big one. I just wish it didn't take so long. It took me too long to learn that one.
Yeah.
Time.
You mean the 23-year period?
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
That's most of your life in a relationship.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
I know. I mean, my relationship, we were together for 6 years. We've been apart for 2, and I don't regret any of the choices. There are moments that I regret all of the choices, but in the real calm sense, I don't. I mean, we have an amazing daughter, and her mom's a terrific person, and she's a great mom, and I've learned a lot about parenting from her. I mean, there's a lot of good there. But there are moments that I'm like, wow, I was 38 when it started, and now I'm 46, and it's like, it's harder to pick up from where I left off. Yeah. And,
But that's regret, which doesn't mean that's going to be, I'm not thankful for, or at least I'm not appreciative of the choices I've made in the past. It's just that I regret. I could say the same thing, except it's changed for me because so much of the scene has changed for me. With losing a kid, really losing 2 kids.
Yeah, that's the thing.
And a wife. And a wife that goes crazy about it, and she basically, I became ostracized in the whole community that I knew in Asheville. Most of it centered around Evergreen School, charter school, because they were all my friends, and she was a teacher there, and I just, I felt like I lost the support of everybody around me, which has made it hard for me to stay in Asheville, to be honest. It's not the place it was when it was the place that I was moving to when I moved here.
Right. It's
changed, and it hasn't changed at all in that regard. It's just, for me, it's changed, or I've changed. So, I mean, I'd like to, it sounds petty, but, if I could, I'd be like, I wish my kids weren't born, I'd never met her. That's, it's really rough when I hear myself say that, and I feel like, damn it, why did I go down that route? But then, that's like dark times. And the worldview for me is we just, you're not going to go anywhere unless you make a decision. And I made a decision. I'm going to hang out with this girl for a long time, and we have kids, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
That's not a bad decision. And I did love her. I don't still love her. But I think that's not probably the most common emotion you get from divorced couples. You probably say, yeah, I still love her, but it's changed for me.
Yeah.
To where I wouldn't say hate. It's just that I get this. For someone to do that to their kids is just beyond me.
Yeah.
It's kind of revulsion. So I guess I always feel like whatever decision I've made in my life and continue to make, I stand by it. Like, I make it because that was the decision I made at the time, and that's good. And I usually, I make good decisions for the most part. I'm not an idiot. I'm not getting into trouble all the time. I, really get into any trouble, unfortunately. So,
I'm too old to get into trouble.
Looking back, it's easy to say I shouldn't have done that, but that's not how life works. Life works by doing it right now. Whatever you decide now is what your history becomes later. We all have history. And so I'm fine with that. It's just, it is what it is. And the fact that Zai died, when that happened, I remember being surrounded by friends and saying, you know what? I took one for the team, because somebody always has to take one for the team. It happens every day. People's kids do die young, and it happens. And if you're not on that team, you're lucky. But I just happen to, be the guy.
Team humanity? What's
the team? I took one for the team, meaning the whole community. Let's say Asheville. In the community of Asheville, a couple kids die every year. Those people took one for the team, so the rest of the kids can keep going on. Most kids don't die young. Yeah. But it does happen, and to realize that and realize, I'm the guy, what bad luck. But there's nothing I can do about that, and I don't feel like Lee or I were responsible for that. It was motorcycle related, but really it was about a kid coming out of the entrance instead of the exit to a community on Beaver Dam Road in his dad's Suburban, making a bad choice in terms of getting on the road, and I just T-boned him. And the fact that his mom came from a family of not only motorcycle racers, but race car drivers, NASCAR race car drivers. One of her uncles was a driver for the Cartoon Network for many years. And her dad taught all of her kids, all of them, he's got a sister and two brothers, all of them to ride motorcycles, and had a motorcycle dealership in Jackson, Mississippi, which one of his sons now runs. And me growing up with bikes, in my 20s, I don't feel responsible for Zai in that regard, because he actually got a good lesson from people that had been there and knew the danger of that kind of sport. And he was really into it, and he'd been well prepared, and he'd taken courses, and he was actually working at MR Motorcycle at the time when it happened. So, I'd love to be able to blame something, but I guess what I'm saying is, it's just, it happened, and guys, I'm the guy that took one for the team so that the rest of y'all can keep moving on, and I just have to deal with it. There's no regret in that. It's just like, it happened to me and my son and his mom and his sister. Yeah.
Well, it's very generous of you to take that perspective. I mean,
well, blame doesn't get you anywhere.
Well, blame. I don't mean that that's your only other option, but just that notion that you taking one for the team. I remember. This is, if I may say, almost more horrific, but it reminds me of a story I learned in Kabbalah. Not Kabbalah, in Chabad. There's a Chabad center here. It's a Jewish learning center, and they're very, very traditional, but they're very open. I mean, you're not going to change their ways. They're very orthodox,
right?
But they don't try to turn you into an orthodox person. They just educate you using the Talmud and whatever. Anyway, on the one class that I took pretty much all the way through, and every class I've taken has felt like a variation on this class. It was called Talmudic Ethics. And every ethical dilemma boiled down to rights versus responsibilities. So your rights as an individual versus your responsibility to your community. That was pretty much everything boiled down to that. And they told a story about a guy in the concentration camps. And one day, Hitler announced they were going to kill 1,000 16-year-old boys that day. And if there was a bar, and they had to walk under the bar, and if they were tall enough to hit the bar, they would live, and if they were too short to hit the bar, they would die. That was how they were going to determine which 1,000 kids they killed, classic kind of Nazi randomism. And this guy knew that his kid was too short to hit the bar, and so his kid was going to die. And he had some jewels, and he had some things, and he could have bribed his way out of it and saved the life of his own child. And he went to the rabbi, and he said, what should I do? My son's going to die, or I can save his life, but then someone else's son is going to die in his place, because they were going to stop at 1,000. graciously.
Yeah.
And so the rabbi ultimately said, I can't tell you what to do, but the Talmud would say, it's if you if you allow your son to be a part of this, you're not involved. You're not interfering with something. It's horrible what's happening, but someone's going to die. If you save your son's life and kill this other child, you are then responsible for that other child. You're participating in the death of another person. And so ultimately he made this choice to sacrifice his own son so that he would not knowingly and deliberately be responsible for the death of another man's child.
Yeah. Which is the community.
Yeah. So it reminds me, like I said, it's like a mind-blowingly different perspective. I mean, because it's not like you said you woke up that day and it was decided that somebody's child was going to die in a motorcycle accident, and you said, well, you raised your hand. I mean, but it's a similar, I mean, it's an amazing perspective for you to be able to take on. I don't know that I could do it.
Well, you don't, and nobody would know until you're
confronted with it.
And then it's just who you are inside, depending on how you deal with it. And that's an unknown until it happens. But yeah, lots of depression around it though. I spent the year after, just really in dark moments. And also we went out the day after he died on a Monday. We went down to. I found out all his buds showed up, and they're like, "Oh, we've been doing, this little mini bike and motorcycle running around the Sam's Club parking lot every Tuesday, and we should do it in honor of Zai." I was like, "That sounds cool. Let's do it." And I brought Shade, my daughter, and his cousin Devin was there, and he was like, "I'll come." They were the same age, or actually, he was a year younger than Zai. So we went, and we had a great time. And I was on my buddy's little pocket rocket, little mini bike, and I totally high-sided and flipped and landed on my shoulder and tore my arm away from my body. All the cartilage was gone. And so that just happened. I didn't plan that. I did not want that to happen. I was not working for a year because of that, because my shoulder, I couldn't wipe my ass with my right hand. I had to use my left hand and all kinds of weird stuff. So, but I also felt like I took one for Zai at that point. I was like, oh, it's okay, because this is something they did to celebrate. They did it all the time. He was part of this crew that liked to have fun on bikes, and nothing dangerous, per se, but not that this wasn't dangerous. But I screwed it up. I was having too much fun. But I also felt like this was I didn't regret doing that. I felt, it happened, and I was there honoring my son the day after he died at Sam's Club parking lot of all places. And it was, I don't regret that at all. It just happened. So the lesson for me is you can't plan where your life's going. You just have to honor as much as you can when your life is happening, as it's happening, and look at it as honestly as you can and say, this is just life. It just happens. We have very low control for the most part. Which isn't a bad thing. It's the way everything works on the planet, I think. We just evolve and we move along and things happen. It's only man that pretends he can mastermind it all, and we can't.
Do you have a spiritual life, since you're kind of talking right on the edge of that? I mean,
I hate religions. I don't hate them. I feel that religion, more than any other human activity, has been the cause for more pain on this planet since the very beginning of our existence. And that's because it essentially is somebody else telling you what's going on. And in my life, I've done a fair amount of spiritual exercises, let's say, from spiritual retreats and sitting at the feet of masters kind of thing, to psychedelics and stuff like ayahuasca and stuff where there's a spiritual reaching out. And I've had moments in pure clarity without any drugs or any circumstances where I feel like I've touched a higher source. And so I believe that there's a spirit that's part of us, that's out there. It's not a religious action for me at all. So I do feel strongly grounded in the idea that there is, I don't like to say higher power because I'm not sure that power is part of it, but something higher for sure. Something more than we are. And I also believe that we are capable of accessing that in ways that probably none of us, maybe a few individuals over the course of time, have realized. And I certainly don't. I just know that we can access more of that sense of spiritual flow, if you will, that's riding there all the time. We're just ignorant. We're not in touch with it, based because of the way we live our lives, the way the culture surrounds us. And I think animals, other than humans, are way more in touch with that sense than we are. We just don't recognize it. And we don't recognize that they recognize it because their language isn't the same as ours.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, yeah, I think there's a strong spiritual component in my life. It's just, it's personal. It's something that I remember as I woke up one night in my bed many years ago and just had this moment. And the moment was really deeply spiritual. But if you asked me what happened, I couldn't tell you. And if you said, well, can I have some? I couldn't give you any of it. I couldn't share any of that with you. It was just something that was personal, but it was intensely spiritual in the sense that, you know, if you want to say it this way, I was talking to God. Not God, but talking to some type of higher, something beyond just me as a human. Yeah, just keep me out of church. That's all I can say.
And yet you moved into a valley of Baptists.
Yes. Well, yeah. I remember a couple years after we lived in our first house in Leicester, there was a little box house being constructed, and it was completed. And we were wondering, well, who's going to move into that? It's going to be a young couple. And sure enough, Shade and I were walking up the road one day, and there was a woman coming down, young woman with a little girl, a little baby toddler. And it was our new neighbor, and we greeted each other. How you doing? And then her next question was, so what Baptist church do you go to?
Wow. Not a lot of
I didn't have an answer.
Yeah.
I had no answer.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah.
I know when I moved to Asheville, and I'm Jewish, so like anything that's at all smacks of Christianity smacks me pretty hard.
Yeah.
And I'm trying. I mean, it's like I'm trying to soften around it, and I don't even know if it's something that's optional. But I did voluntarily put a Christmas tree in my house this year for the first time ever that I chose, or like went there and bought it, because my daughter's, you know, she's half Jewish, and she likes to remind me only half Jewish.
And it's a tree. Trees are awesome.
A tree. Yeah, trees are great. Well, and we have someone who lives with us, a tenant, and who's a friend, and she wanted, you know, she has all the lights, and she sort of politely asked me, like, oh, you thinking about getting a tree? And I said, if you decorate it, I'll do it. So anyway, so that's what happened. But I remember when I moved here, I would see like 3 churches on one corner, you know, or 4 churches on, like every corner had its own church. One was Baptist, one was Methodist, one was Presbyterian, and one was whatever the other one. I mean, I couldn't understand why you needed that many churches. Like, how different are they? And I remember when I met her mom online, which is, you know, not even a stigma anymore, although back then it still might have been. And I remember, you know, looking at different profiles and stuff, and people would say things like, you know, I'm under spirituality. They're like, I'm very open-minded spiritually. Like, I was raised Baptist, but I would consider other religions like Methodist, Presbyterian, you know, and I'm like, that is not a different religion. Not from my perspective. I mean, I understand that they've all got their own sort of angles on things, but
it's ibuprofen for the masses. I think churches have become a panacea, and it's long-standing, so it's an entrenched system that, you know, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years it'll wean its way out. I'm a pagan. If I'm anything, I'm a pagan. Yeah. I'm probably an anarchist too, but I'm a pagan by religion in the sense that I think that everything around us, the world, which people call nature, but it's everything, including the air and the stars and the lack of air out there in the universe, is what teaches us. That's our teacher. That's our guru. You know, if we want to bow to someone, it's nature. You know, and there's lots to be learned from that, and it will calm your soul, and it will spur up your heels so you'll get moving. All that stuff can be found taking a freaking walk in the woods is all you need, I think, for me. Yeah. And I understand that people take a lot of comfort from their religion, and I don't want to take that away from somebody, but I think in the long term it's killing all of us. The idea of organized religion is separating us from our nature, our true nature as animals on the planet. Paganism, celebrates that in that respect. And it also celebrates the idea of a deity, or at least, the idea of a power that's beyond just human power or whatever, human ability, human consciousness.
That also opens up the idea that everything in nature is of the same creator, whatever that is, same creative force or creative origin. Yeah. And so, I mean, I know in Eastern spirituality, one of the phases of enlightenment is I am that. It's that you look at something and it's not just like you go, oh yeah, I'm that thing. It's not an intellectual thing, apparently, but it's actually like an experiential. You feel it. You're like, I'm that horse. I'm that whatever. I mean, I had that experience once in my life when I had ingested the San Pedro cactus in Ecuador out of a shampoo bottle. So the guys hadn't cleaned the shampoo bottle enough, so I was like burping up shampoo. It's already like this horrifying swamp juice that makes you want to puke anyway. And then
what's San Pedro? There's another name. That's not Datura.
No, there's another name, and I can't think of it. Yeah. If I do, I'll say it. But anyway, we took this stuff and we were like on top of a hill because we wanted a view. But then it was like it started coming on pretty quickly, and I was like, it's so dry up here, and I'm so thirsty, and I'm like, we're gonna die on this hill, So we gotta get down to the water. Let's go to the river. I'm gonna sit by a river all day. I was with these two other guys. It wasn't their first trip. So they're like, cool, man, whatever. They didn't care. One of their names was Freedom, and the other guy was Gary. And they were these guys who I'd met, down there, and they were crazy. They were from Oregon. They were real good old boys, but Oregon good old boys, which is a different
kind of nature boys.
Yeah, it's a different. It's a different gene pool than the good old boys from the South, but still very just good guys, but also pretty wild. So we were sitting down by the river, and we spent the whole 11 hours at the river. And we bought like a bunch of bananas from some kid who was selling bananas that were just picked off the tree. So they were actually sweet, these little tiny Chiquita bananas, Finally understood the song. I was like, they are delicious, if you haven't been shipped in the hull of a boat and picked months before they're ripe. And there was a horse that came down on its own, just like wandered down to where we were. And I remember looking at that horse, tripping pretty hard. But I remember looking at that horse and turning to Gary and be like, oh my God, dude, that is me. Like, I am that horse. In that moment, I completely felt that I was that horse. And then that was a really powerful moment for me. And not that I would advocate taking drugs to achieve that moment, but having had that moment, I knew that that idea exists.
Yeah,
and then I remember
connectedness.
And the fact, the idea, the I am that consciousness, I got a glimpse of it. Yeah. And then there are problems with taking drugs to have those glimpses. When the door closes, it slams shut pretty hard. It's hard to get back there. But so that was one experience, and the other was I wanted to be over the river, like looking down on the river, and there was a tree going over the river. And so I climbed up on the tree to within my comfort zone. And then I thought to myself, if I was a bobcat, I would crawl up the rest of this tree and I'd get a better view. And I was like, but then I would probably fall into the river, and that's how kids die in Ecuador on drugs.
You thought that?
And I had this whole thought. So I was like, I'm not going to do it, because I don't want to be another story of some kids who, took too many drugs in Ecuador and fell head first into a 6-inch deep river. But I'm looking down, I'm like, the rocks look so soft from here, I was like, but I knew, they're not soft, so I climbed down off the tree, and that was the end of that. But Those are the two most memorable moments in that 11 hours spent by the river talking the whole time. You know, yeah, that was something. But to bring it back to what you were talking about, I do think, like, how is it possible that one thing would be of creation or God or whatever? I mean, I can use the word God because it doesn't have the same stigma for
it's
me.
not the
Like,
Christian God.
But you know, how can any one thing be from that and not all things be from that? Like, either it all is or it's all not. I mean, I don't see that only some things.
Yeah, it's a pretty simple question.
Yeah.
It has a simple answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not what religion, organized religion doesn't teach that. It teaches that this is the way. If you listen to me and my books and my teachings and my scrolls, this is the way. And how do you deal with that? How do you say, well, what about the other ways that I see all around me? The Methodist Church, whatever, the Presbyterian, the Anglican. How does that work? But if you're caught up in your own church, you can do you do the thing on a Sunday, and then the rest of the week you're busy working.
Yeah.
And prepping meals and hanging out with your kids and watching YouTube.
Well, I remember there's this joke. This guy gets to heaven, and St. Peter's showing him around, and he's like, "Who are those people over there?" And he's like, "Those are the Catholics. They're doing Hail Marys and stuff like that." And who are those people over there? And those are the Baptists, and they're doing whatever they do. And they said, "Who's those people over there?" He said, "Those are the Mormons. They think they're the only ones here."
Exactly.
And that's everyone, not just the Mormons.
Yeah.
It was pretty. I mean, it was a Mormon who told me that joke. So
that's good.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be. Otherwise, it's it's.
But once you reach that state of once you touch or taste that state of connectedness, it's very difficult to go back from that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I think I did that. The first time I really did that with any great impact was ingesting mushrooms. Eating. Actually, they were cultivated psilocybin in a jar, in a mason jar. And that was, and your statement about the closed door is true. After that, it's like, wow, what do you do with that? Once you've been exposed to something that you think is one of the most incredible things in your life, and then it's not there after the drug is gone, and your brain is readjusted to its quote unquote normal self. How do you deal? But it still leaves you with that. For me, it left me with that sense of that there is an undeniable connectedness to everything. It's not the internet. It's not texts. It's not smartphone. It's out there in all of us. And I don't mean humans. I mean all of us.
Yeah. Blades
of grass to whatever. Everything that's here is connected. And it's not just this, if you take care of your lawn, it'll look nice for you. It's a connectedness that's at a spiritual level where it's made of the same stuff, and there's probably communication going on that we just don't even realize that's connecting everybody.
Well, I think the thing this is just something that's been up for me lately in my situation is, when we do something that is disrespectful or unkind to another person, we think we're doing it to them. But there is a very real place where we're connected to them, where we're one with them. So doing something awful to someone else is doing it to ourselves. And unless we're feeling self-destructive, and I think in those moments that's not the motivation, we're all about destroying this other person because there's that ignorance around the idea that they're not different. I mean, there's one level where they're distinct, but there's another very important level where they're not. And I think that's a huge part of what messes us up is thinking we're more of an island than we are.
I think that's true, but here's a question that bothers me. Why and I spent 6 years in boys boarding school, so I know something about this, but why, and also one of maybe 3 white guys in pretty much all black school in Barbados and West Indies. What makes us attack those that are different? What's the underlying reason or the emotion that causes us to, and I've seen myself in a situation where I can't do that. I probably have some kind of natural inclination somewhere because I think it's in the human psyche, but I've seen where I can't. If someone falls to the ground and I'm like, oh, let me help you. And then 3 guys come around and kick him because he's on the ground. What is that makes us move that way?
Well, there's a lot of possible answers for that, and I probably don't have all of them. Maybe I do, actually. Let me read.
Jason.
Only I would choose to answer
You
a
think
question
you
that
do.
way. Yeah, no, I mean, I know that I don't enough to pretend that I do or could. I mean, I had a teacher who would say a couple things around that. You know, he would say, I mean, there's one is identity. Like, we identify with who we are, and like attracts like, and because we believe in the illusion of the surface level of who we are,
Sameness, yeah.
and we believe in the illusion of sameness, what appears to be the same.
Yeah.
And so with something that appears to be different, and we're ignorant of that deeper level where it is the same, where it's connected,
Right.
We feel like, well, if we can just get rid of that other thing that looks different, then everything here will be the same.
So the quest is to become, our innate quest is to become connected to everything.
Some would say that the only force in the universe is the desire to take separation and bring it back to oneness.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's the only force in the universe, and in an emotional level, that's love. That is experienced as love.
Yeah.
That force. On a physical level, it's gravity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is a mind blower for me.
But that's true. That would give rise to feelings of hate and persecution and all this stuff that we do to each other because we feel separate.
We feel separate.
Not connected.
And the experience of separation is extremely uncomfortable. But it's the experience that we become habituated to. And so out of force of habit, we continue to propagate what is comfortable and familiar.
Yeah.
So in the desire for oneness, we actually invest and spend more energy increasing the level of separation. Because we think that that's going to give us the feeling that we want, but it doesn't. You can't. It's not eradicating other. The heads side of the coin doesn't become the only side of the coin by eradicating the tail side of the coin.
Yeah.
It's a coin. There's always going to be both sides. If you eradicate the tail, the head goes with it, and that's a thing that we also, I think, we miss.
Yeah.
See, I did have the answer.
That's good. I like that. So we have to
and
go.
You doubted me.
So no, I didn't doubt.
I knew you
there
had
was
the answer.
Yeah, I knew there was something there. But we need to. So we need to. Is there a big picture? Is there a cone? Is there something we can learn from that will help us not judge so quickly?
Well, I think
the guy's on the ground. He's just he got. Who knows what happened to him, but he's weak and he fell and he's on the ground, and the urge of the guy standing up is to kick him. How does he transmute that urge into the urge to pick him up?
Yeah.
What is it? There's this violent side of us. It's not just men, it's men and women, it's all of us. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple forces at work there. There's ignorance is the biggest one. The ignorance that we're connected, so kicking the person on the ground is kicking a piece of ourselves. That's one thing at work. But you were asking, what's required to get past that? Humility, like real humility, and empathy, 2 things I'm freaking horrible at. It's all those, and then the weird thing is all those virtues that religions talk about. Even though I agree with you that the way they talk about them is...
No, but it's good stuff. There's so much truth in religion. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, there's all good... Not all, but most of it is really good stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff that we've learned through the ages.
There's tons of good stuff to be had in there.
Is it good parenting? I think of myself as a little kid. I wouldn't have done that as a little kid, but I know, and I'm talking like a 5-year-old, but I knew other 5-year-olds that would do that.
Sure.
So do we learn that by age 5, or do we have to come to learn it by the time we're 25? Or does it take that long to? and I would place money on the guy that wanted to kick the kid when he was 5 still wants to kick the kid when he's 25. And as part of that,
If he
our role
doesn't,
models as young, as young people, our parents and our teachers and all the other people that are our teachers in life as young kids, is that what, do we get affected by what we see, the guy yelling at the woman and da-da-da-da? Does that become our role model that we learn early on?
absolutely. I mean, the way we handle our kids when they behave adversely to what we want.
Yeah.
We think like, well, that's going to curb their behavior. It might in the moment because they're just trying to get out of the way. But what they learn more than anything, in my experience, is, oh, that's how you handle when you don't get what you want.
Right.
And so my daughter talks to me in all kinds of unacceptable ways. And I'm like, where did she learn that? It must be her mother. So,
that's easy for you to
yeah.
say.
So, well, no, I mean, that's, I only say that when it's obviously me.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. I say it both times. But just I'm hedging my bets. But yeah, I mean, so I think there's a piece of that. I think the kid who kicks the kid on the ground, learned a piece of that from home. But there also can be a kid who comes from that same home and would have the opposite response.
Yeah.
So it's not.
No, I think some of us are born with more empathy. I really do. I think there's a gene that comes into play of some sort, or genes, and that we have more sensitivity to certain things and more empathy about our fellow people, whether they're animals, pets, or just animals at large, or humans. But role models certainly play a part.
When I had a very intense spiritual teacher in practice for 7 years. It's part of why I moved to Asheville, was to study with someone in particular. I'm not studying with him anymore, although lately I've been it's crazy, but I've been slowly starting to feel like, wow, I'm almost ready to consider doing that again. Like, my life so much has happened, and I've kind of come full circle, and I might be ready to kind of open myself up to that again. I've started meditating again, which is the core piece of that practice, is having a daily meditation. But when I studied with him, he taught us a lot of different things. We learned hands-on healing, we learned astrology, we did a lot of personal process work, and he's a pretty gifted and amazing guy, and he understands physics and math, and he would share a lot of different concepts so that we were examining this thing called life from all these different angles. And one of them, which now that I feel like I'm going to discredit myself by saying it, but I don't care. One of them was astrology. And not that I would lean too heavily on it, but I'm always amazed when I read my astrology, how much of it is just dead on true to me. Like today, I was looking through pictures in my Dropbox, and I'd photographed some pages from some Vedic astrology books that were about my chart. And I just happened to read one of them today, and it's like, problems with a problematic mother. And most people probably feel like they have problems with their mother, but my mom and I have very specific issues that really get in my way, and then problems with the heart and chest, and I have a heart murmur. And it's just like, how in the world is that in my astrological chart? So let's pretend there's something there. It speaks to the interconnectedness of all things. Like, the moment that your chart is determined by the moment that you're born. That they have to pick something, and so the moment that you kind of enter the space-time continuum, they take a picture of the sky. That's your natal chart, and then they map everything out from there. And the idea that would have nothing to do with your parents and everything else is unfathomable if you see everything as interconnected. If you see everything as completely random, then it doesn't matter. They're a bunch of independent events. But I have found more support for the connectedness of things as I explore it and I examine it. More and more connections make themselves known to me, and I'm able to do something with that, as opposed to just chalking myself up to the randomness of it. Because I can't really go anywhere with randomness. It reminds me of the.
Does that seems like it's a vote for religion, in the sense that religion helps people. but it doesn't tell me that it's true.
Well, religion, to me, offers a couple things. I mean, the church offers community. There's value in that.
Yeah.
But religion takes very abstract concepts and linearizes them. Mm-hmm. And then people live in terms of the linearity, and the nature of life and existence is nonlinear, in my observation. So even though things are connected, that doesn't make it linear. Like, those connections aren't necessarily linear. That's why I think solving the mathematics of the universe is abstract algebra. I mean, it's not straight addition and subtraction.
Right.
And so, I have this sense that when Jesus spoke, he felt into, let's just assume Jesus was real and everything. I don't feel the need to be
I'm with you.
disparaging or to anyone who might be listening. But let's assume he's real, and let's assume he said all the things he's credited for saying. I mean, that to me is someone who tapped into a very deep level of his own being and tried to give expression to it. Mm-hmm. A very abstract quality of the healing nature of being, and he tried to give expression to it. And when the words came out of his mouth, they came out linearly.
Right.
And people attach themselves to the linear quality of the words as opposed to the abstract nature of what they meant. So the meaning gets lost. The words get learned. But the words without the meaning, it's not so different from a piece of furniture that might look beautiful, but if it's not put together well, it's not going to hold up.
Yeah. So
it's the $10 chair. Yeah. The church is the $10 chair.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
We did it.
You brought it all around.
We got it all the way back. Yeah. Yeah. And the hard work, you could even equate this. We almost did it. You could equate, when you talked about, nobody's willing to spend the money to pay for the time it takes to do something right. Similarly, it's a rare person who's willing to put in the time to do the work, to find the abstract nature of things in themselves. Yeah. It's much easier to go to church and have somebody just tell you how to do it and just try to do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it puts you on a road. I mean, it's not a bad road per se, but it's a road towards war and division and unconnectedness in that sense in the long term. Because of the linear, I think you're expressing well, because of that linear nature, it's not how we work as humans. We're complex. I liken it always to an evolving spiral. It's not a circle, it's a spiral moving one way or the other, up or down, you take your pick. But that's a complicated system that will never work if you say the sky is blue. It's true, the sky is blue, but there's a lot more going on to the sky than just the sky is blue. Right. And maybe that's where Jesus' teachings got. Now, the fact that we could somehow know all of the words he spoke, it would astound my mind. If this happened a long time ago, and there's been a lot of editors involved, and I'm an editor from way back when, and I know how that works. I'm the 100th monkey, and I did not hear what the first one said. So, but still, if he's speaking from the Spirit, because he's connected, and so he's coming out with what he can come out with. But it made me think of my 9-time bed experience where I woke up and there was no way to express this, what was going on, in a linear fashion. It was just a spiritual, spiraling, complex thing that was very truer than most of my daily life. And yet, how would I explain that to you? I couldn't go out and teach it on the pulpit. Not sure what that has to do with woodworking now.
Well, there's a difference between having an experience, being able to give expression to the experience, and then being able to guide people towards their version of that experience. Those are different abilities.
That's where Asian philosophy has always drawn me. I've been always drawn, just to anything in the Far East. Chinese these days, a lot of China philosophy has grabbed my attention, but a lot of Japanese too, and anywhere in the Far East. That there's more of a sense of here's what I see. This is my truth. Now make your own lotus, you know. And they're trying to help by giving you signposts, but they're not giving you the book. And once you hand the book over, it's like, oh, I'm on page 237. I'm almost there, man, because I'm reading the book, and the book isn't going to tell you. It's just going to be a signpost. And most of the churches that I know of are not, they don't operate that way. You know, Western churches are here's the book and it has to be done this way. And that's not where true answers come from. Or it's not even an answer you're looking for. It's just you're looking for connection. Just want to know that you are connected, you know, this brief time you have. And I don't, you know, I rarely get it these days. I mean, I know of it, but I don't feel it and get it. I feel, you mentioned randomness. I feel a lot of my life is extremely random past few years, which is not a happy place to be. You know, that doesn't mean that I can't look and get connected in different areas.
That's the value of a high functioning meditation practice, because when you do a meditation that works well, and that's a dangerous statement for me to make, but when you do a meditation that works well, you rest into the organized part of yourself. You know, the underlying structure of existence, while it's completely abstract, it's also extremely organized in its own way. It might, and so things that seem random suddenly aren't random, or the idea of free will and predetermination come together. They're not
separate.
Yeah, they're not separate. It only seems like we want to think we have free will because we want to believe that we can make our own choices, and maybe to some degree we can. We can go left or right, or we think we're choosing making that choice. Whatever. Let's pretend on that spectrum we've got 10% free will. The other 90% is predetermined. Where we live, who our family is, all that, a lot of that stuff we came into. We didn't just get airdropped onto the planet. It was spinning and we landed, and some of us landed in Africa. And, well, maybe actually, depending on how you believe with the soul. But even that, there'd probably be some connectivity because of the like attracting like. Like someone asked my teacher, you know, are you always, if there's past lives, are you always with the same family? You know, lifetime after lifetime. And he said, well, not necessarily. But when sticks and leaves are floating down a river, they tend to travel together for at least some of the time. And maybe they come apart, but they come back together. You know, every once in a while a leaf gets stuck in an eddy current and the rest of the leaves float on without it. But by and large, you know, they float down together. And I thought that was kind of a nice description of that.
My meditation, my high functioning meditation would be spending the day cutting dovetails by hand. I got a handsaw, a Japanese pull saw, a bunch of sharp chisels, a little mallet, a knife, a marking gauge that has a knife that strikes a knife line in my wood. And I become absorbed. I lose myself. The focus is immense. It has to be tremendously pinpoint to be able to do that and do a good job. And time disappears, you know, in that sense. It's like sitting at meditation and losing your ego, not losing it, but putting that in a quiet place and not having that out front clamoring at you all the time. And it's a wonderful place to be, and you don't even know you're there until you finish and you look up and go, where was I? And you were just woodworking.
Yeah.
A lot of it's like that.
Yeah. I used to have days like that in the shop. Not quite what you're talking about. Not that level of concentration, but I would be in there and I would be working for a couple hours. I really had it painting what I painted before I did, you know, where I would just get lost in the painting, and I'd be there for 3 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, and one thing was for sure: if I was painting, I was not making war. Yeah. And I remember my aunt coming in, who's like, I love her, but she's a super materialistic interior designer, and you know, she's a wonderful person in the context of her proclivities, you know, and her late husband, we were having a conversation about God and all this stuff, and I was really like into this at the time, and there must have been 10 people in the room, and I was talking for way too much, and her husband, who was still alive at the time, said, "You're like now," and her husband said, "You know, my God is money."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I remember thinking like that is the most obnoxious thing to say, and in the case of this man, it was the most enlightened thing to say. He really understood how money is equal to God. Like he got it. He got money on the level that God functions.
Right.
Like
right.
that money, with money anything can happen. You can do anything with money, sort of, you know, like a hell of a lot. And so for him that was his God, you know. And it was like this incredibly shallow and profound statement at the same time.
Yeah.
So my aunt, or I guess they're cousins, whatever. She was, they were in my studio and I was painting, and I was telling them, I was like, she's like, how can you spend all your time in here painting, you know? And I said, I don't know. I just think the world would be a better place if this is what people did. So it's what I'm doing. And I'll tell you, when you mentioned regrets earlier, people ask me if I have regrets every now and then, or if I wish that I was still painting. And I will say one of the few regrets in my life is that I don't paint anymore, because I'll never get those paintings back that I didn't do when I was 25 and 26 and
gone.
27. They're gone.
Yeah.
It's such a direct link to the subconscious that there's just no way to get it back. You know, it's a Polaroid of everything in your being where it's lining up at that moment. And and people are like, well, you'll do it when you're older. I'm like, maybe, but I won't do that when I'm older.
No, that's gone.
You know?
My background is fine arts. I studied art at a really wonderful community college in Newtown, Pennsylvania, Bucks County Community College, and had come from a family of artists, so I had innate skills to begin with. Which has actually stood me in good stead as a woodworker, because as a designer, it helps a lot, tremendously, to design furniture with an artist's eye. And I painted, and I did a lot of drawing, did a lot of sculpture. And I was thinking recently how, God, I haven't drawn, just like still like life drawing. I'd love to do life drawing again. I used to really enjoy that. I used to do it for hours. In fact, I used to model myself, which was interesting. But that whole thing, you know, it's like you get caught up in your daily life, and all these things that you knew you have in your past are really hard to take out of your pocket anymore and make change with. You know, I'd love to be able to do it. And I could. I probably will at some point do something, but there's a huge aspect of my artist self that never sees the light of day. Like you're saying, you know, it's there, and it used to be there in force, and now I'm consumed with other stuff. Or I'm just, you know, biding my time, and surviving, you know, and I don't make room for that.
Milling trees.
Yeah, doing something usually. Or watching a movie. I'll watch a lot of movies. That's in a way that's biding time, which is okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot better than making war. I don't want to make war.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the artist's life is a tough one, because we're constantly looking at our world all the time, and so we become, if we aren't already sensitive, we become hypersensitive to our world, because we're looking at it and not necessarily judging it, but we are looking at it and trying to see what it is, and it takes a lot of energy to do that on a constant basis. And woodworking is one way for me to do that, because there's a real mechanical side to woodworking. That's the other aspect of me that I love. It's like you said earlier on, you got to be a machinist if you're going to be a furniture maker. Well, you do. You have to know nuts and bolts and all kinds of mechanical type situations. And that's not the time that I start meditating, when I'm under the table saw wrenching.
Right.
I am not meditating. I am busting knuckles, blood's dripping onto my face, and I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going wrong. And it gets fixed, you know, and then you get back up there and you do something that's more meditative. That, you know, the dovetails, to me, cutting dovetails by hand is like still life drawing or life drawing. Sitting there and your soul knows something, and you're trying to get it out there and put it on paper or wood or whatever medium you're working with. And so it's a digging process, and it's ultimately it feeds you. I think, you know, you come away enriched to some degree in your life, if you're wrenching on table saws all day, you're going to come away just wanting to get the hell out of there and go home, drink your Budweiser. I don't like Budweiser.
I think we did it.
Yeah, it's fun talking with you.
Oh, it's great, man. I mean, I feel like we had some good talks, but it was always like we had to be doing something else.
Yeah.
You know, and the opportunity to sit down and do this when this is the thing we're supposed to be doing.
It's like it was overdue.
Yeah.
We've had our conversations cut short. This one we were able to cut long.
Yeah. That's nice. Well, thanks for doing it.
You're welcome.
And I'll let you know when it's available for listening.
Yeah, dude.
And
I want to thank Adam for commandeering the technical aspects.
Yeah, no kidding.
Thanks,
Our
Adam.
Producer Adam. He has created a little miracle in this dining room of the house, you know. So thanks very much, Adam. And Adam's gonna, as long as he can stand it, he's gonna be here for all of these. So
yay,
we're
Adam.
grateful for him. And then he's got to edit it. I mean, it's not. These are gonna be, you know, as unedited as possible. The whole idea is for them to be uncut.
There's always editing. The only thing that's not edited is a poem.
We did it. My first podcast ever. I can't even tell you how good it feels to launch this thing. I know everyone and their dog has podcasts these days, but this is truly significant for me. Words can't describe how elated I was the moment Learning to Fail became official and I could see my logo on iTunes. I want to give a special shout out to my tireless producer, Adam Fields. Adam has been in the trenches with me for over a year, because that's how long it takes for me to do anything. I have been waiting for years to have this conversation with Andy. I couldn't know for sure if it would go this deep, but I hoped it would, and I'm glad it did. If you like what you heard, please visit our website, use our Amazon portal, and rate us on iTunes. Make sure you tell your friends about us, and if you feel so inclined, please consider making a donation on our donation page. That way, we can keep failing for years.